A witch was performing a summoning ritual on a huge magical circle. A loud bang startled her, leaving her gasping for air. Her physical strength was depleted due to the high magical energy in the land, and even her magic wand had broken. However, fortunately, she managed to complete the summoning successfully. In another world, a man deeply asleep was suddenly awakened by a glowing door that appeared and transported him to a strange forest. Surprised and frightened, he saw many dragons flying across the sky. Overwhelmed, he pondered about the previous day when, after a long day of work, he had gone out for a year-end drink and took the last train home. Before he could gather his thoughts, a loud voice from a girl made him angrily jump up and open the door, where he saw several women dressed as sorceresses, each holding a magic wand. His face stiffened in confusion, thinking they must be cosplaying as witches. Suddenly, one of the witches, referred to as a princess, boldly charged towards him despite the others' attempts to stop her. Annoyed by the loud screaming that had disturbed his sleep, he yelled back at them. A loud explosion occurred, sending sparks flying and knocking the group of witches backwards. The witches were convinced he was a demon, as he had unleashed a powerful magical whirlwind. He confidently approached to discuss the recent incident, but they started trembling with fear as he drew near. With such formidable power, the witch princess's legs froze, unable to move. She wept bitterly, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded for her life. The man felt confused, explaining that he only wanted to send them away because they were too noisy, but he hadn't expected things to turn out this way. Suddenly, he grabbed the tip of the princess's hat and demanded to know what was going on. She jerked back, looked at him with hatred, and revealed that his home and land were situated in an area dense with magical energy, explaining that such a powerful and terrifying force had also affected him, granting him this formidable magic. Confused and unsure about what concentration of magical power meant, the man found staying there pointless. The princess and the other witches teleported away, leaving him alone, not knowing what to do next. However, after hearing the princess's words, he felt pretty awesome about himself. A mere clerk who could summon a storm with a shout. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a girl lurking in the shadows, softly uttering the name Aruji-sama. Basking in his newfound coolness, he missed the sweet voice of the girl due to his excitement. He rushed inside to check on food, clothes, essential supplies, and bedding, all of which were in order. Then, he collapsed into sleep, only to be awakened shortly after by a loud explosion and terrified screams outside. It turned out that the witches and the princess had run out of magical power while trying to defeat a giant monster, and their only option was to flee. But their luck worsened as another monster appeared, with dragons flying behind them, leaving them no escape route. Unable to flee, the princess resolved not to abandon her people and charged forward. The monster breathed fire towards them, causing a thunderous explosion that shook the earth. The man's peaceful sleep was again disrupted. Furious and at his breaking point, he flung open the door and shouted for silence so he could sleep. Suddenly, a whirlwind appeared from afar, sweeping away everything along with the monster. Unintentionally, he had easily defeated the monster. He hurried over to check on everyone, but as he approached, the witches appeared even stranger, trembling and crying incessantly, with a mysterious fluid dripping from them. After inquiring briefly, one of them sobbed, asking what his intentions were, stating she needed to preserve the lives of her people. He was indifferent to such matters, merely wanting the girl to remove the giant monster so it wouldn't occupy the land. She panicked and stammered that the dragon was very powerful, one that even 10 professional adventurers could not defeat. The dragon's scales could be sold for an incredibly high price, and its heart could serve as a magical catalyst more potent than any gemstone. The princess wondered how he could easily give up such a precious treasure. Yet surprisingly, he remained indifferent to these valuables, merely asking her to keep her distance so he could have a good sleep. The princess Dianea Prussia, the second princess of the kingdom, nodded in agreement. She magically lifted the dragon, introducing herself and promising to repay his kindness, then cheerfully went on her way. After resolving the noisy disturbance, he hurried back home to continue his sleep. A while later, he felt he was lying on something very soft, and startled, he opened his eyes to see an incredibly beautiful girl with a radiant smile in front of him. He was lying on her soft, creamy thighs. She informed him that lunch was ready. Confused, he wondered if he had forgotten to lock his door, to which the girl mysteriously replied that the master had locked it carefully, and she wouldn't allow anyone in except the master. Flustered, he asked who she was, and she introduced herself as Sakura, the spirit of the house he owned. She expressed her joy and happiness, having met her master for the first time in decades, but had hidden out of shyness. He suddenly remembered that this was the large Sakura wood house his grandfather had mentioned. Sakura was surprised and touched that he remembered her existence. He remarked that his grandfather had told him indeed in this otherworldly place, his house had turned into a person. Sakura then brought him a delicious bowl of noodles for his meal. Delighted by the tasty food, his eyes lit up, but he couldn't help wondering how there was electricity to use. Sakura explained that she maintained the house's electricity supply through her magic. He marveled at how amazing magic was, allowing one to have whatever they wanted, and then he began to devour the bowl of noodles until it was completely empty. However, he still couldn't understand why he had been brought here. Upon questioning Sakura, he learned that the house and the land it occupied, which were also her, had transformed into a hub of magical energy. Specifically, it was a dragon vein, a place where various powers converged, powers that also accumulated in his body since his birth and during the time he lived here. That explained why each time he exhausted his strength, he could unleash such powerful bursts. However, this was just a part of his abilities, and an excited Sakura encouraged him to try using magic. Later, when he stepped outside to test his powers, he saw the desolate aftermath of the recent commotion. He mentioned wanting to plant something in the garden since the fridge was almost out of food. Understanding his need, Sakura conjured an apple and suggested he use its seeds to grow an apple orchard. He was skeptical about the ease of the task, but she assured him that with his powers, it would be as easy as pie. Sakura continued, explaining that her powers resonated with his, and he could use them freely. She instructed him to touch her body and visualize the trees growing. The touch felt overly sensitive, making his face heat up, turning as red as a ripe gourd. Sakura then suggested he touch her face, clarifying her intent. When he placed his hand on her head, she suddenly cried out in a sensitive, pleasurable way. Embarrassed, he withdrew his hand quickly, but Sakura gasped and softly told him to imagine the trees growing, and she would handle the rest. Closing his eyes, he placed his hand on her head again. Suddenly, a blinding light shone on Sakura's enduring face, and the soil burgeoned, sprouting a fresh sapling. He shouted joyfully and turned to check on Sakura. She assured him she was fine, just overly excited, and urged him to continue. Once more, he closed his eyes and placed his hand on her head, and soon, a large apple tree grew, blossoming and fruiting in moments. Exhausted and exhilarated, Sakura collapsed to the ground, exclaiming how wonderful it was. She reassured him not to worry about her, plucked an apple, and handed it to him. He took a bite and immediately savored its freshness and sweetness. The two stood chatting under the gigantic apple tree. Suddenly, they heard a whooshing sound, and out of nowhere, a rainbow-scaled dragon swooped down, grabbed Sakura with its hind legs, and swiftly flew away. The man panicked and called out Sakura's name. The scene shifts to Danae, Prussia, who was collecting gold and silver from that dragon, when she spotted another dragon with delicate rainbow-colored scales, unmistakably a supreme species known for its magical resistance and agility. This species was rare and attracted to magical hotspots. Meanwhile, the man was thinking of ways to save Sakura, planning to imagine the giant apple tree growing even larger. Fearing he couldn't do it without Sakura, he still decided to try. He focused, closed his eyes, and visualized the tree growing. Immediately, the tree burst from the ground, growing taller rapidly, its top reaching the dragon and causing it to panic and drop Sakura. Realizing she was falling, she suddenly opened her eyes and screamed, while he maneuvered the apple tree to catch her and leaped to embrace her. However, the dragon was stubborn and kept creating whirlwinds to threaten him. Sakura realized it was targeting the magical hotspot located here. Just as the tension reached its peak, his stomach growled loudly, signaling his hunger. Feeling helpless but inspired by this, Sakura suggested they could eat the dragon, noting it looked quite tasty. Deciding on the spot, he declared he would slay the dragon right there, shouting as if announcing the monster's end, then unleashed a powerful whirlwind that blew the dragon miles away, dazed in the sky before it vanished. Seeing the dragon attempting to escape, Sakura urged him to convey his intentions more precisely through visualization. Understanding the issue, he took a deep breath and commanded, "Shed all." The whirlwind grew immensely, sweeping the dragon into the vortex and causing a colossal explosion. Due to the force of the whirlwind, even Princess Danae, who was nearby, was caught in the whirlwind, thrown off balance, and sent flying, her clothes in disarray. After he and Sakura retrieved the dragon, she cooked him a delicious rainbow dragon steak, which looked incredibly enticing. He took a bite and his face lit up. The dish was exceptionally delicious, and he could eat it endlessly without getting tired of it. The two of them laughed and enjoyed themselves, while Danae had to endure the effects of the whirlwind and continue alone through the forest, feeling anxious and sad. The protagonist continued to use magic to grow delicious apples, thinking he had mastered the art of using magic for apple cultivation. Sakura appeared and suggested moving on to the next step, which left him confused as he didn't know what the next step was. Sakura offered to demonstrate. She told him to touch her and transfer magic through his touch. He placed his hand on her shoulder and began the transfer. Suddenly, the apple tree sprouted additional branches, and its trunk deformed and swelled, resembling a huge onion with eyes, arms, and legs. A living scarecrow made from the tree, ready to obey commands immediately, making tasks like apple harvesting or garden cleaning more convenient and suitable. Suddenly, in Sakura's mind, images of bizarre monsters wearing wolf masks flashed by. A wave of panic hit her, and she called for her master, wanting to merge immediately. The protagonist thought it was too soon for such intimacy, since their relationship wasn't that close yet. But given his male instincts and being outdoors, he boldly asked for her help. The two closed their eyes and bumped heads, the proximity allowing him to feel her breath and heartbeat. It felt as though no distance was left between them, a warmth spreading through him, possibly the feeling of becoming one as Sakura had mentioned. Just as he was getting excited, he suddenly found himself transported to a strange place. Before him was a bird's-eye view map of the area around the house. Her memories had synchronized with his, allowing him to feel everything she felt. This shattered his dreamlike state, making him realize that merging had a different meaning altogether. Sakura, deep in thought, now informed him that 65 magical beasts, attracted by the magic, were converging, invading their location. To convey this information as precisely as possible, she had synchronized their feelings. Here, the leader of the werewolf tribe ruling the edge of the magical forest, Guru Garyu, lifted his face to the sky and laughed heartily, confident that the werewolves would conquer and dominate the entire forest. They were gathering their forces into position, morale soaring as they raised their swords in unison, determined to annihilate completely. The first squad reported that the entire army was ready to encircle at maximum speed. All 6 werewolf squads heard the command and advanced, preparing for battle. The protagonist, along with Sakura, watched the enemy's movements angrily, unable to forgive their brazen intrusion into his territory. In a vast forest, the werewolf army, numbering 65, was charging fiercely. Communication from Osa made them tighten their encirclement even faster, and the leader ordered a massacre to advance and shred the enemy, ensuring coordination and collective action. The werewolf army aimed to surround the protagonist's house and eliminate him and his companion to rule the forest. They arrogantly licked their lips, growled, and leaped forward. The map beeped, signaling the enemy's approach, one after another focusing on the magic of the protagonist's house, all 65 surrounding it, leaving him severely outnumbered. In this tense situation, Sakura advised him to use her since they were synchronized, and just by using magic, he could create traps anywhere he desired. Without hesitation, he began immediately, bumping heads with Sakura, closing his eyes, and preparing the trap. As the werewolves leaped forward, a gigantic apple tree suddenly sprang up, blocking their path. The tree grew larger, alive, and aggressive, moving towards the werewolf army. Soon after, many giant tree scarecrows attacked them. The werewolves panicked at the rage of the scarecrows, surprised by the size, thinking no scarecrow could be that large, typically only human-sized at most. Yet it grew even larger and absorbed the magic of the area. As the tree scarecrow approached the werewolves, they screamed in fear, calling for their leader. Guru, furious and crazed, drew his sword and charged. The protagonist, confident in his power, declared this his territory, and showed no mercy to those who dared invade. He commanded the golems to eliminate the werewolf pack. Just a few seconds later, the giant golems had kicked the corrupted wild wolves, sending them flying thousands of kilometers away. Sakura, with a radiant face like a blooming flower, praised her master for his spectacular display, successfully using the golems. He modestly smiled, surprised that he had accidentally created such effective traps. His stomach began to rumble with hunger, a result of using so much magic. Seeing this, Sakura cheerfully went to prepare lunch for her master. The nearby city of Prosia had briefly been in a state of panic due to the appearance of the giants. The protagonist was walking through a forest filled with trees, rocks, and occasionally some strange creatures. He began to reminisce. It had been a week since he arrived in this world. In his old world, he would leave home at 6 a.m. and return on the last train. He was now accustomed to this life, even to seeing flying dragons as no longer unusual. Returning to his familiar home in the forest, he heard Sakura's familiar voice, anxiously saying that beasts were planning to intrude on their land again. He patted her shoulder and urged her to synchronize with him to see. The figures that appeared were the werewolf tribe, pulling a cart with jars and bags of something, along with a cloaked figure whose face was hidden, looking very mysterious and different from before. Their demeanor seemed serious and their numbers fewer. It seemed their purpose was not to cause trouble, and he naively decided not to use traps. The protagonist boldly stepped out of his house to confront them, asking what their purpose was. The werewolves were startled and quickly informed each other that he was the king of the magical land. The entire werewolf army knelt solemnly and greeted their king, then introduced themselves as the werewolf tribe ruling the edge of the magical forest, with one of them, Guru Garyu, acknowledging him as their king and vowing to follow him. Then, the mysterious figure uncovered their face, revealing a naked girl with animal-like ears and a tail, evidently also a member of the werewolf tribe. The werewolf chief said he wanted to offer his sister Lily as a sacrifice. Lily's hands and legs trembled as she sobbed and pleaded with the king to eat her. Startled, the protagonist quickly covered his eyes, panicking about how he became a king, and why this werewolf girl was naked. After a few seconds of thought and still confused, he asked the wolf leader what was going on. The leader insisted that he eat her, explaining that his sister possessed high-level magic among werewolves, and consuming her would strengthen his magic. Shocked and angry, the protagonist yelled at them, questioning if they really thought he would eat human flesh, calling them fools. Leader Guru was startled and fell over. The protagonist explained that they were mistaken. He had no intention of becoming their king, or of eating anyone. If they agreed to come in peace in the future, he would act as if this incident had never happened. The werewolves froze, silent, wondering if he truly forgave them, even though they had intended to harm him. They all stood up seriously, declaring their surrender and readiness to obey any command, or to be used in any way he saw fit. He approached the wolf girl and said they should no longer bother him, and that no one should harm them, then draped the cloak over her. The wolf girl, touched, blushed and embraced her brother. Crying loudly, the siblings moved by the moment. The protagonist thought that although they were werewolves, their nature was not much different from humans. He told them if they were done, they should leave quickly. However, the group still wanted to offer something to their king, so they brought out all the tributes from their storage, hoping he would accept their heartfelt gifts. He said he would accept, but only took one bag from the pile, stating that was all he needed and the rest should be taken back. The werewolves were grateful, solemnly saluting him before leaving and thanking him for his generosity. Now they had food prepared for the evening. Sakura excitedly said she would make his favorite stew with the meat and vegetables. Having a more varied menu each day is a good thing. In the kingdom of Medes, capital Prosia, Princess Diana Prussia, carrying 2 bags of golden treasures, arrived exhausted, determined to meet that landlord today. Meanwhile, the protagonist and Sakura were strolling in the apple orchard, dragon still a common sight in the sky, when he spotted a strange-looking yellow apple. Curious, he plucked it to see if it was safe to eat. Next to it, there was another identical yellow apple, which Sakura also picked and wanted to try. They decided to taste them together. After taking a bite, they both enjoyed its exceptionally sweet and rich flavor. Suddenly, a feeling of intense heat surged through them both, like a whirlwind of desire reaching its peak. The protagonist embraced Sakura, preparing to confess his feelings since their first meeting. But before he could speak, he heard voices from somewhere above and, surprised, asked Sakura if she had said something, to which she replied she had not. Looking up, they saw 2 flying dragons talking to each other, mentioning that the Dragon King had forbidden them from coming here as any dragon appearing would be eaten. It turned out the yellow apple contained the hint of dragon magic. Previously, they had defeated a small dragon nearby, and its blood, a magical accumulator, had mixed with the magic in the land around their home. Excited, the protagonist wondered if he could gain more skills from the essence or blood of such creatures. Suddenly, a loud explosion disrupted this eager atmosphere as a giant apple tree golem sprouted from the ground, its trunk grabbing Princess Danae and lifting her up before dropping her abruptly. Surprised and angry, he harshly asked the witch how many more times she planned to encroach on his garden. The princess, confused about what was happening, hurriedly apologized, explaining her real name was Danae, and that being called a witch made her feel embarrassed, asking if he could please stop. Exhausted, he asked what she was doing here today, and she almost forgot her main mission. This was her way of thanking him for the last time he saved them from the flying dragon. Danae then placed 2 bags of gold in front of him, containing 30,000 gold coins and 3,000 silver coins, enough for him to live luxuriously for a year. He was surprised that she had gone through such trouble just for him. Blushing, she couldn't deny it. She had promised to repay him after he saved her life. As they were chatting, suddenly 2 large and ferocious-looking dragons flew overhead, speaking arrogantly as if they owned the sky. The Dragon King had declared that a very dangerous person was present here. But the dragons didn't care how powerful the person was. They just knew that if he had strong magic, regardless of being male or female, he would be delicious. They planned to kill the 2 commoners in front of them to taste what human flesh was like. The protagonist looked up annoyed and commented on the noise, questioning since when did such bossy creatures fly over his head planning to eat him. But soon, many more dragons arrived, more than 10, throwing all 3 of them into a state of chaotic worry, especially Princess Danae, who was so frightened that she could barely stand, fearing they might die there. Overwhelmed by the unexpectedly large number of dragons, the 3 were terrified. The dragons had surrounded them from all sides, with no other choice but to confront them, as his strong magic had attracted more and more dragons. One of the leading dragons shot forward, instructing those behind to follow. They arrived, and Danae said she also wanted to help him, at least do something. She unleashed the strongest magic she could muster. The spear of the Flame Emperor shot out, incinerating the dragons in a massive explosion. But when the dust settled, not a single dragon was down. They were unscathed and got up shouting. Danae was horrified and shocked at her own ineffectiveness, wondering how she could possibly defeat more than 10 dragons if she couldn't take down even one. The dragons began to gloat, realizing the humans couldn't even touch a whisker on them, posing no danger at all. They decided to unite and obliterate those below in one fell swoop. Sensing the danger, the male protagonist was about to step forward and use his power when Danae stopped him, saying she could still fight. She was tired of always being saved by him and expressed her frustration. She told him to slap her buttocks because in the past, her now-deceased mentor used to do so, which always motivated her. Hearing this, he was startled and panicked, not knowing what to do. But seeing the monsters approaching, he resolved to defeat them, and, ignoring the awkwardness of the situation, he slapped her buttocks, declaring, "I will satisfy you, whether it's your buttocks or anywhere else. Just show me how you defeat them." After being slapped, Danae felt a surge of energy and an odd sensation of warmth in her buttocks, signifying the rise of power and magic within her. The dragons prepared to attack, exhaling a fireball towards her. The princess used all her newly endowed strength to launch a gigantic flame sword, piercing through the dragon's fireball and incinerating them with the heat of a massive explosion. The beasts roared in horror, each turning to dust. The superpower caused the dragon to burn up like grilled fish and crash to the ground. Danae was astonished by her own superpower, having defeated the mighty dragon so swiftly. Meanwhile, the remaining dragons, terrified, communicated amongst themselves, realizing that the Dragon King's warnings were true. These humans were too dangerous, and they quickly retreated. Danae wondered if his magic had enhanced her own, transforming her abilities so drastically. She trembled from using all her strength and wondered why he could still remain calm, as if nothing had happened. He didn't know the answer either. He just hoped she can handle a dragon like she did before. He didn't care much about the magical support this time. He was just impressed by her efforts to overcome it on her own. Suddenly moved, Danae realized that indeed she had defeated the dragon herself. Dragons are highly valuable creatures, and each time she had been reluctantly given one by him, it made her feel embarrassed. She asked him if he was dissatisfied with himself, partly because she was the reason he and his house had been summoned here, unable to return. Upon hearing Danae's words, he suddenly realized and shouted at her, accusing her of bringing him here, and now he couldn't return. Seeing his home, Sakura worried, he sighed and said it didn't matter where he was as long as he had Sakura by his side, and that he enjoyed being in his own house every day. Sakura, the house, smiled back at him happily. Princess Danae hurriedly thanked him. He didn't know why she was thanking him. She explained it was just because she felt reassured hearing him say that. Now that her magic was depleted, Danae would return to retrieve the dragon tonight, asking for permission to come again. And then she said goodbye. The male protagonist planned to leave the dragon for a golem to easily remove from his land, making it easier for Danae to take it away. Feeling hungry, they decided to have a light meal of pudding cakes and then take a nap. Meanwhile, as Danae was returning to Persia, the charred dragon suddenly blocked her path. Confused about why the dragon appeared there, she guessed that he must have left it for her. Without much thought, and as it was getting dark, she teleported with the dragon back to Persia. The head of the Magic Knights was surprised to see a person with a dragon and asked Danae what it was. She responded that it was the dragon that had been burned by her spell, asking him to exchange it for money to add to the national treasury. He was shocked that even superior dragon scales, which could block magic, were burned black, surely indicating the princess's power had increased. He looked at her joyfully, knowing the knight's leader would be delighted to hear this. In contrast to his cheerful demeanor, Danae spoke somberly, expressing that although her mentor would have been pleased if it was solely her doing, this time it was because of the monstrous landowner's additional support that she was able to defeat it. Support that should have required a ceremony was now used by merely touching it, an ability only possessed by supreme magicians or those in legends. It was a surprise to find someone so powerful in the forest. There were predictions that the sleeping Dragon King would soon awaken. Could this be a major impending disaster? Near the protagonist's house, a beautiful young girl holding a magic staff was intently staring at the house. The atmosphere was tense. Who was this young woman, exactly? The girl gazed at an apple tree while the protagonist and Sakura walked through the garden. They suddenly noticed her and thought she might be lost. Pointing at the tree, the girl asked if it was an apple tree, to which he awkwardly confirmed it was, despite its yellow color. She introduced herself as Hesty and expressed her happiness to meet him. Just as she reached out to shake hands, her stomach loudly growled. He asked if she was hungry, and she absently replied that she didn't know. It was just her stomach making noises. The protagonist suspected something was amiss and quickly asked Sakura if it was okay for the girl to eat an apple. Using magic to assess her, Sakura found that the girl had an unusually high amount of magical power for a child. She assured him that Hesty would be fine but would possess immense magical power. Surprised, he plucked a yellow apple and handed it to Hesty, who took it and slowly bit into it. Her face instantly lit up, her eyes sparkling as she quickly finished it and reached out for another. He was alarmed at how hungry she seemed, needing to eat even the core. Realizing Sakura was chuckling, he learned she had a fondness for children. She reminisced about how he used to be full of playful energy as a child. They both chuckled awkwardly, finding it odd to discuss this with a house. After eating the apple, Hesty smiled and praised how delicious it was. He smiled, patted her head, and invited her to visit whenever she was free. Surprised and a bit embarrassed, Hesty then asked to leave. The three of them said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. The protagonist had assumed that the girl was just an ordinary witch, perhaps the most normal person he had encountered in this world. However, to his surprise, Hesty was actually the Dragon King, fully named Hesty Redona. A close dragon companion praised her for safely leaving the domain of the two masters, Sakura, and then provided Hesty with clothes. After changing, she emerged with a completely new appearance, fitting for a Dragon King. The dragon continued to inquire about the investigation into their combat potential. Hesty paused thoughtfully before admitting that she didn't really want to fight them. Although she couldn't defeat them, she didn't wish to destroy their place either, feeling that they were much stronger than she had anticipated. However, the foolish dragons kept rushing into attacks whenever they were ordered, even those that had witnessed the protagonist's strength. Ultimately, Hesty decided she would challenge the protagonist to a duel. If the other dragons saw his strength, they would know to back off. This was to be a battle of survival for the dragon race. If she won, he would die, and if she lost, the foolish dragons would give up. She resolved that, as the Queen of Dragons, she must lose with honor if she were to lose. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in her own room. Sakura was making odd movements, rolling around in bed with her face flushed from a rush of desire and passion. Suddenly, she heard a call from afar, It was the protagonist calling her out to the garden, which looked a bit devastated from the dragon's destruction. He couldn't fix it while a huge boulder was blocking the path, so he was considering using golems to move it, wanting to synchronize with her. She appeared exhausted, panting heavily. Concerned, he asked if Sakura was all right, to which she replied that she had rushed out upon hearing him call. He cautioned her to speak up if it was too much for her. Her body was still sensitive and not accustomed to being touched on the head. So when the protagonist placed his hand there, she still felt a burning embarrassment. He then created 2 golems, but thinking they were too small for the boulder, he came up with the idea to combine them. If he channeled magic into his hands, he could control them more easily. After finishing his explanation, he quickly placed his hands on the golem, feeling its body very soft. He thought he could mold it, but suddenly, his hand got stuck, and the golem began to move and mimic his posture. He hadn't instructed it to move, yet followed his motions. Excited, he clenched his fist, and as expected, the golem mirrored the action. It seemed he had synchronized with it. He gleefully thought of a new idea, placing the 2 golems close together, then molding and sensing them. Seeing him so active, Sakura was reminded of how playful and cheerful he was as a child, and she couldn't help but smile softly. After a while, he transformed into a giant, majestic golem, capable of controlling it as if it were his own body. He exclaimed, "This is the combination of 2 wooden armor golems." Sakura was surprised and delighted to see that it was made from golems. Although its appearance was a bit odd, resembling a mecha, he could control it completely. He gently lifted the huge boulder, thus resolving the issue. He then set about repairing the garden. Sakura smiled gently, a familiar smile that seemed reserved just for him. After a long day of work, repairs and upgrades became much easier with his wooden armor. He expanded the garden and installed some new traps, excitedly telling Sakura that he had gotten used to making these traps. She tiredly smiled, praising him for his wonderful work. Moments later, Sakura's consciousness began to fade, and she fainted. He rushed over in panic, holding her and shaking her gently, asking if she was all right. Sakura weakly opened her eyes and said not to worry. It seemed she had used too much magic. She had been too happy and used more than she had replenished. He asked what she meant by replenishing. She explained she drew magic from ley lines, so it was fine. She just needed a few hours of rest. However, when he turned back to look at the house, he saw it shaking violently, warping as if it was about to collapse, affected by her deteriorating health. Worried, he pressed her to see if there was any other way to fix things. Embarrassed and panting, she replied that one way was for him to give her some of his magic. He smiled excitedly, happy to help Sakura in any way, and asked what he needed to do next. She hesitantly explained that the simplest and most convenient way to replenish magic was to satisfy a need. In this case, it meant satisfying her sexual desires. Surprised, thinking he had misunderstood, but Sakura tearfully said she needed him to fulfill this urge. He awkwardly asked if she was sure she didn't need food or rest instead, to which she replied that she found it hard to sleep and food didn't replenish the lost magic sufficiently. Thinking it over, he realized it was true, as he had never seen her sleep or eat to recover magic. Hesitantly, he asked if this was the method she always used to replenish her magic. Sakura, embarrassed, confirmed it was, but she had never depleted her magic to this extent before. He was stunned, thinking she had been struggling alone with this method to restore her magic, and quickly apologized for making her discuss such a sensitive topic. He continued, saying receiving his magic would help her recover faster and better, so he decided he would go through with it. He then lifted her in a princess carry, firmly declaring his intention to fulfill her needs, which deeply moved her, her eyes glistening with anticipation of the joy to come. Outside, it had begun to rain, with raindrops pattering against the tiled roof. Inside the warm house, the spirit of the house was ailing, and there was only one way to cure it. The protagonist placed Sakura on the mattress, and, with a flushed face and sweating, shakily asked if she was ready. Embarrassed, she couldn't look him in the eyes, turning her face away and asking him if he was sure it would be all right. He looked around and saw that cracks were already appearing everywhere in the house, which seemed on the verge of collapsing as her body weakened. He gently asked if everything would be healed if her magic was restored, to which Sakura confirmed it would. She explained that she was merely the spirit of the house, unsure if her body was compatible with his, apologizing for suggesting this course of action. He quickly reassured her that he had no problems with this arrangement, telling her he found her very endearing and liked her personality. He didn't want to see Sakura in such a poor state and would do anything to help her recover. He confidently stated that as long as it was for her, he could do anything. Sakura was moved by his words, sitting up with tears streaming down her face, genuinely happy to hear him say that. She had always thought of him since he was born, and now they were here together. He felt a mix of embarrassment and self-reproach, realizing that he had always seen her just as a house, but now all he could see was her, just Sakura, and they were finally together. He then gently caressed her face and tenderly kissed her. Outside, the rain grew heavier, and on the soft mattress, a naked girl lay with an expectant, bashful expression. The protagonist awkwardly said he was about to begin, and a moment later she gasped out loud. Noticing she seemed uncomfortable, he tenderly inquired about her well-being. Sakura assured him she was fine, explaining that hers were tears of happiness. The leaky roof quickly restored itself, indicating the effectiveness and speed of the recovery. He panted and said he was going to start moving. Each of his movements caused her more pain, but also immense satisfaction. After a struggle, he was exhausted and fell asleep on her lap, sleeping soundly. She smiled gently, stroking his hair and softly stating that he was her only master and the only one who could be inside her. The next morning, he woke up to find himself in a strangely larger house, twice the size of the old one. Panicking, he exclaimed, wondering what was happening and why the house had an additional floor. Sakura, embarrassed, explained that his magic had been so potent that she thought she might be pregnant. He accepted that she was pregnant but was puzzled about how that related to the house having an extra floor. She happily explained that as the spirit of the house, naturally, her child would also be part of the house. He was momentarily baffled, but then seemed to understand, laughing and asking if they would get another floor every time he gave her magic, and that this was his way of making their house bigger. After adding magic to Sakura, his house had become two-storied. They walked down the stairs, admiring the new ground floor, which was spacious, beautiful, and even fully furnished. He chuckled and scratched his head, telling Sakura that it was incredible. She modestly replied that she hadn't done anything. It was all due to his magic that had provided the necessary power. He was stunned, realizing he hadn't actually done anything tangible, and then they moved to the second floor, which he found very satisfying as it truly felt like home. Noticing the small house in the backyard, he asked if that too was created last night from restoring her magic, amazed at how much had been produced from the process. Since the place was quite peaceful, they thought about renting it out, like becoming landlords. He commented that if they found someone good in this world, they would rent it out. Sakura was delighted to hear this, thinking it would make the place livelier, but she asked him to continue living on the second floor as she didn't want to be alone. He cheerfully reassured her that he wasn't going anywhere. This part of the house made him feel comfortable. The room and the furniture might expand, but this was his home, and he didn't want to change that. Sakura breathed a sigh of relief, thankful as she had been worried he might prefer the new rooms and leave her. He joked, asking what she would think if he did prefer them. After a moment, she happily said she would work hard to expand the main house even more if that's what he wanted. She continued, saying he was the chooser and she was the chosen, which is why she would always strive to be by his side. He laughed heartily, reassuring her that he had no intention of moving, telling her not to worry about that anymore. A week later, he panicked and shouted in astonishment, as the house had grown to 7 floors in just 1 week, during which all he had done was eat, sleep, and relax, appreciating the slow pace. He suddenly realized that they hadn't done anything except sleep next to each other. Sakura appeared and mentioned that it seemed the magic he gave her was still too strong. She couldn't contain it, and it leaked when they were together. In other words, just by sleeping next to each other, they could add more floors to the house, which kept growing taller. They were up on the highest floor of the house, enjoying the breeze and the beautiful view together. He was amazed by the enormous size of his house, which had continued to expand ever since he transferred magic to Sakura. He thought that being so high up, they would need to keep an eye on the lower floors. But Sakura mentioned that the golems would take care of any intruders neatly and cleanly. At the ground floor of the house, Princess Dionea was bewildered, unsure if she was looking at the protagonist's house because it was so large and different. Hearing some noise, he looked down and guessed that Dionea might have come again, debating whether to go down to meet her. Sakura suggested he try the new elevator, surprising him as he hadn't expected Sakura to have built an elevator there. She explained she had used magic to create something similar and laughed, saying she wouldn't go down because she needed to prepare dinner. He then entered the elevator alone, praising how convenient magic was and also happy about the spaciousness of the house, wondering what to do with the remaining 5 floors. Seeing the princess looking confused, he approached and learned that she thought she had come to the wrong place, because it looked so different from before. He awkwardly explained that a few things had happened since her last visit, and he and Sakura had been busy. She excitedly bragged that she could have come sooner because her work had become easier lately, and she had managed to sleep 2 days ago. Noticing the dark circles still under her eyes, he was reminded of his own days in the old world, tirelessly working day and night, hardly sleeping just to meet deadlines, which suddenly made him feel a pang of empathy. Today, she also had a reason for visiting. She placed a bag of silver coins down and asked him to accept it, saying she had brought 1,000,000 silver coins this time. He shook his head, saying he didn't need the money. Dionea was bewildered and wanted to know the reason for her gratitude. Since its arrival, the entire surrounding area had been enveloped in magical energy, leading to abundant harvests and high-quality animal products. In essence, as long as he freely used his magic outdoors, they would reap many benefits, and wanted to thank him. Therefore, they wanted to offer him silver and gold as a token of appreciation for bringing prosperity to the kingdom. He reluctantly agreed to accept, thinking she didn't want to owe anyone, then called a golem to bring it inside. Remembering her last visit and the golem attack, Dionea was visibly frightened, questioning if it was necessary to call a golem. Suddenly, a line of golems assembled side by side startled her, and she screamed, wondering why there was a whole room full of golems. He proudly thought of it as a compliment. He had converted the first floor into a golem storage room. A formidable golem stepped toward her, making Dionea fearfully suspect if he had plans to invade her kingdom, as she couldn't believe that such formidable constructs were merely housekeepers. He thought she was overreacting, assuring her he would never do such a thing as he was content with his current home and garden. He referred to them as golems, but they were just apple trees. Relieved but still intimidated by their presence, Dionea felt suddenly tired. He called a golem over and plucked an apple, offering it to her as transportation costs, suggesting that the magical energy within it would surely help her recover. Dionea was touched, thinking he cared about her well-being, and felt something greater than friendship stirring within her. She then excused herself to leave early, while he, also tired, contemplated the presence of kobolds, dragons, and the desire to invite more people to live there. Ultimately unsure what to do with the lower floors, he consulted Sakura, who simply said synchronization would suffice. Afterwards, the house returned to its original state, and he was delighted to be back in his smaller, familiar home. It seemed small, but in reality, he had hidden the other floors underground, and especially the 6th floor was reserved for the golems on guard duty. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. They turned to look at the faint silhouette, curious to see who had returned. It turned out to be Hesty, who had come back looking completely different, wearing a costume change that included 2 horns, symbolizing her dragon royalty. He jokingly commented that she looked very different from the last time they met and asked if Hesty had gotten a new hairstyle. She replied that last time she was in disguise, but today she had done her makeup and changed her hairstyle, as the white hair was too conspicuous and made it difficult for her to go anywhere, so her servant had dyed it for her. Suddenly, Hesty gripped her magic staff and declared that she no longer needed to hide. His eyes blurred as he saw the girl transform into a kimono worn at funeral ceremonies, worn only when one must make a life-or-death decision. Today, Hesty had come to say goodbye and thank him for the apple from before. He, puzzled, said it was no problem, acknowledging that people here did not like to owe others. Hesty then showed him a large map, the map of this world, pointing out various places, including Prussia, the city of witches. Starting from there are the city of the Holy Knights, the kingdom of beastmen, and countless other kingdoms and cities. She offered to teach him useful knowledge about these places if he wanted, and if he already knew, then never mind. He naively admitted he knew nothing about this place. He didn't want to leave his home, so everything far from here was unfamiliar to him. But if she wanted to teach him about this world, he would gladly learn. He bowed deeply, 90 degrees, asking her to teach him. She was both surprised and shyly whispered, "All right." Sakura wanted them to have the most comfortable and natural atmosphere, so she excused herself first, not forgetting to tell Hesty to teach him well. Then he crouched down and asked where his house was on the map. She pointed to the location and said it was right here, known as the Forest of Spirits or the Forest of Temptation, located to the west of the Dragon Valley. No wonder there were so many dragons around here. As they were discussing animatedly, suddenly a large rock nearby began to stir and then stood up, fully formed with arms, legs, head, and muscles, but all made of stone. He was annoyed because the conversation had just begun when it was interrupted, but Hesti calmly suggested they continue. She explained that this forest contained many high-quality magic stones that Prussia often used to make magical tools, and sometimes these stones naturally combined to form golems. Suddenly, the beast stepped forward and crushed the map. Hesti continued to explain that it had almost indestructible regenerative abilities due to its composition. He panicked and asked her if it was too strong and what they could do to defeat it. She explained that with the right material, they could attract the golem. Hesti pulled out a shimmering gemstone, which was actually a dragon scale from a powerful dragon he had once defeated. She suggested if he threw it, it would lure the golem away from them. He immediately did so, throwing the scale with all of his might at the stone beast. However, the dragon scale pierced through the golem, causing a huge explosion. He was shocked, thinking something was wrong, as it didn't go as she had said. It seemed he had unwittingly channeled magic into the scale, turning it into a lethal weapon that the golem couldn't regenerate from. Just then, Hesti's stomach growled with hunger. He handed her an apple, suggesting it as a snack. She happily took it and bit into it, her face lighting up with the supernatural energy of the golden apple. As it grew dark, Hesti thought she should head back and asked him if she could return again. He cheerfully assured her she could, and she thanked him with a smile that seemed slightly somber. Back in her hideout, the dragons were furiously flying around, outraged. One of the dragons charged at Hesti at an incredible speed, furiously reprimanding her for not fighting the protagonist and reminding her that their time was nearly up. The closed dragon companion then flew beside Hesti, reporting to the Dragon King that the impetuous young dragons would rush to their demise if she didn't act soon, emphasizing that it was her duty to intervene. Hesti was silent for a moment before responding that she was aware but asked for just one more day, pleading for them to wait a little longer. The next morning, while the protagonist was picking apples, he noticed Hesti had come to visit again. He told her to wait a moment as he was in the middle of harvesting. Shortly after, he instructed the golems to handle the rest of the work. Hesti presented him with a Dragon King's scepter and a cloak, urging him to accept them. Although they looked expensive, she wanted to give them to him as gifts, wishing for them to belong to him. He gladly accepted and thanked her, then put them on. The design was simple, and the Dragon King's scepter was a magical artifact. He had always used his imagination. He wasn't sure if these items were really necessary. Hesti smiled and replied that imagining magic was useful, but not convenient, as using too much magic could lead to exhaustion. Therefore, she advised him to create a key, a word he could choose to use when casting magic to help manage the burden. She took the scepter, prepared to show him how, grasped a branch and planted it in the ground before chanting a spell. Immediately, the dry branch ignited, and after another chant from Hesti, it exploded. She explained that by choosing the right words and defining them according to his intent, the magic would consume less energy. Excited to try it out, the protagonist started with a tree, shouting "Wood Golem," and the tree swelled and transformed into a golem. However, creating one golem didn't drain much of his magic, so he tried again with 5 golems. He succeeded immediately without feeling tired, surprising Hesti as normally, such effects required a list of spells to be effective. Just as they learned something exciting, Sakura came out with 2 cold glasses of water, smiling brightly. Hesti took a sip, finding it slightly bitter but delicious, her face beaming with delight. There were also cakes, which she quickly ate and found incredibly satisfying due to their delicious taste. He wanted to stay and practice more, so he told Hesti she could leave if she wished, but she wanted to stay a bit longer with him. After creating 2 giant golem warriors with formidable might, he truly felt tired. Merging 3 trees into golems had been effective, and he thought about altering their forms, but decided that was enough for today. The protagonist was concerned as it was getting dark and Hesti had not yet left. She explained that her home was close by so she could return quickly, but her expression suddenly turned somber, and she told him that she had a great time. But now, her time was up. Hesti forced a smile and said goodbye. He looked puzzled, not understanding what she meant, and as he was momentarily distracted, Hesti was no longer in sight. In the Dragon Valley, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense, as if a major battle was imminent. One of the dragons roared out that the next morning, the White Fire Dragon King Hesti would fight, and that tomorrow, everyone would come to watch the Dragon King's duel. Hesti felt a heavy burden, sighing deeply, her face pale, wondering why she had to rule over such fools. Another fierce dragon urged the dragons to prepare for the battle, making her silently think that this one must have nearly a century of experience to have survived so long. Hesti told the dragons that she had a responsibility to her kin, so this time, she would help them. The close dragon companion apologized to her for the current situation and advised her to prepare for tomorrow's battle. The dragons felt confident, thinking their enemy was just a human, and they were far more in number, so surely this would be a glorious victory. Hesti thought about that place, familiar and close to her, where the inhabitants were extremely kind, possessing immense power used only for good deeds and helping the people and her as well. Hesti spread her arms, drawing magic from the full moon, and slowly grew a pair of massive wings characteristic of dragons, her form beginning to change, as it had been a long time since she allowed magic to flow into her body. Hesti's mind dwelled on his smile. She felt reluctant, but knew this was her duty to her kind, so she was prepared to sacrifice herself to fulfill her mission. Hesti had shared everything he needed to know about this world and magic, and they had enjoyed playing and having fun together during those final days. After transforming, she had become a majestic white dragon, no longer hiding her true form. This dragon was not only powerful, but also deeply responsible, having never faced an opponent that required her to use her full strength. So this time, she had high expectations, even though it meant she would never see this place again. In the Dragon Valley, a magnificent dragon took flight, preparing for her battle of survival. On the highest floor of the protagonist's home, he and Sakura were enjoying tea, appreciating the peaceful and extraordinary scenery. Looking into the distance, he could see the rugged rocky terrain and couldn't believe that it was the Vampire Valley Hesti had mentioned. The protagonist felt that transforming his home into a tower had been the right choice because it was so convenient to see everywhere. Sakura was delighted and enjoyed spending the morning there with him. The protagonist was excited to share that the new way of using magic had prevented him from becoming exhausted, allowing him to wake up earlier. However, he was still worried about whether Hesti had made it home safely the night before. As he finished speaking, a group of dragons flew from the Dragon Valley towards him, led by Hesti in the form of a gigantic, fierce, white dragon. Because of her draconic appearance, he didn't recognize her as the young girl who had playfully taught him about magic. Sakura felt nothing from the dragon's gaze and suggested they should go downstairs, as the dragon's approach would create extremely strong winds. As soon as they stepped out of the elevator on the ground floor, the dragons arrived, exhaling with tremendous force towards the house, causing a massive explosion. When the house was damaged, it meant that Sakura could be injured. She stumbled and could barely stand, but fortunately, the wall was only slightly scorched, and she was okay. The white dragon soared and roared loudly, declaring itself the leader of the dragon clan. It challenged him to a fight, threatening to incinerate the place if he refused. Seeing the situation becoming increasingly dire with fires raging everywhere, he angrily stepped forward and firmly declared that this was his home, and he would protect it at all costs. The protagonist turned back, took Sakura's hand, and began to synchronize at the maximum level, preparing to use the magic key. After reciting the spell, thousands of apple trees sprang up, wrapping around him and Sakura, forming an immensely powerful and robust golem warrior, within which he could observe everything around, while synchronized with Sakura. However, the size of the dragon was still much larger. If the golem was 10 meters tall, the dragon seemed about 30 meters. The dragon's larger size and ability to fly worried him. Sakura encouraged him, saying she would use her magic to protect the house, so he should give it his all. The protagonist felt that synchronizing with Sakura meant that protecting this place was their top priority. He charged forward, shouting that this was his home, where he could live happily, and he would not let the dragons destroy it. The brave golem advanced with such force that each step shook the earth. The white dragon appeared calm, seemingly waiting for the battle, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. In the kingdom of Prussia, a knight burst through the doors, panic-stricken, reporting from the observation team that they had seen the white fire dragon king flying towards the forest of spirits. And not only that, but it was also leading a horde of dragons. If they reached here, the city was at risk of falling. The kobold tribe, wolf people, also realized this and had started to flee in droves. The frightened knight yelled that they must quickly call for reinforcements to help evacuate the capital. One of the knights standing there grumpily said, "Now where do you suppose we run to? There's no safe place when facing that horde of dragons." Everyone in the room, upon hearing this, screamed in terror, the atmosphere becoming intensely tense, as all believed they were doomed. Princess Danae immediately calmed everyone down, insisting it was not the time to panic. She asked the knight how many dragons there were. He hesitated before answering that there were at least 50, currently flying over the forest of spirits, and additionally, a part of the forest had just been burned to ashes. Danae was concerned because the White Fire Dragon King was a legendary dragon said to have destroyed an entire country long ago, and it was rumored to have been in hibernation, until now, suddenly reappearing. Danae ordered the captain of the knights to evacuate the civilians and try to save as many people as possible. The captain expressed his concern, replying that he had already called for reinforcements, but it would take at least a day for them to arrive. Contemplatively, Danae silently picked up her magic staff, volunteering to go and fight the dragon known as the Dragon King herself. After teleporting to the forest, she looked up and was confronted by a horrific scene. A fiery tornado was erupting before Danae, freezing her with fear as she screamed out loud. Suddenly, a golem warrior appeared, blocking the fiery tornado. The princess was surprised, not expecting it to withstand such fierce flames, and wondered what it was that made it so powerful. The protagonist saw her, and turned around to ask why she was there. Hearing his voice, Danae recognized him. He was furious, because the white dragon had not only burned his garden, but also damaged the arm of his armor. The more he spoke, the angrier he became, immediately calling all the golems to merge into his armor and enhance its power. The golems obeyed, enveloping his limbs and body, forming a super strong warrior known as the King fully armored. He determinedly roared that it was time to counterattack. The battlefield was still very tense, with neither side willing to back down. Now was the moment for the golem warrior to strike back at the fierce white dragon, ignoring the dragon's height advantage. Though the golem was much smaller, he continued to fight. The protagonist turned back to check on Sakura, asking if she was alright. She replied that some areas around were burned, but it was manageable, and she could continue fighting. Suddenly, traps emerged from the ground, which Sakura had targeted and locked onto. When he shouted for the anti-aircraft traps to fire, thousands of traps launched simultaneously towards the dragon. It thought it could simply dodge these, but then it flew up high to evade, only to find that wasn't so easy. The tree traps, swift and numerous, struck the dragon, causing it to panic and flounder, unsure how to escape. He then transformed a tree branch into a staff and, using all his strength, hurled it towards the dragon. As it neared, the staff burst into hundreds of branches that grasped at the dragon. Enraged, it breathed fire to burn all the traps, and he, provoked, challenged it to come down and fight, as the heat of the fire seemed so intense that it appeared to explode his magically fortified shield. He worried because the shield, heavily enchanted, had shattered in just one blow. The smug dragon flew before him, with the other dragons cheering, thinking their leader was about to secure an easy and complete victory. The white dragon continued to roar, proclaiming itself the Dragon King and showcasing its power. It then gathered its strength and opened its mouth to deliver the final blow. Panicked, he thought it was about to breathe fire again, planning to incinerate everything around. He sternly yelled not to dare destroy his home further, telling Sakura to use whatever was left. Together, they stood up to end the battle. Despite the armor being so damaged it had exploded, they still made every effort to stand and counter the decisive blow from the white dragon. It had accumulated a large amount of energy and spat out a huge orb known as the Dragon White Flame, which then hurtled towards him. The protagonist summoned every remaining tree to stand and fight. Thousands of trees from the ground combined into a colossal tree that continually launched towards the orb to shield the golem warrior. A spectacular scene unfolded as the fireball and the tree clashed. It was unclear which side would fall first under the power of the other. The fight with the Dragon King continued. The fireball turned into a whirlwind that scorched all the leaves of the tree. He was shocked that it had burned everything entirely, and he focused on channeling more magic into the tree. The power was so immense that it shook the earth, causing everything nearby to be blown away. As he infused additional magical energy, the tree sprouted thousands more branches, combining into a gigantic tree. This tree pierced through the dragon's fireball, and the protagonist, channeling all his strength, steered it through the flames to tightly grasp the dragon. The branches tightened around the dragon, preventing it from moving. Suddenly, the scepter Hesti had gifted him cracked, seeming as if it might break at any moment. He wondered if he had overdone it, using too much magic and depleting his energy. causing the scepter to crack. The stubborn dragon created more fire, determined never to give up, and then spewed flames at the branches binding it. However, this time, the fire could neither burn nor even scratch the branches. The dragon was confused, unable to comprehend why its power had no effect on these branches. It seemed as if the tree binding it also bound its abilities and strength. The protagonist praised the Dragon King, acknowledging it was tougher than the others, but now he would show the true power of his armor. The strength of the golem was composed of 100 apple trees and another element. The magic it absorbed spread from his home to every nook of it. Speaking, he sprinted to the base of the tree with utmost speed and embraced its trunk, exerting his strength to lift the enormous tree in preparation to slam it down to the ground. Straining, he called out to the dragon to end it quickly, as the giant tree slowly uprooted and fell with tremendous force. The dragon, terrified and unable to react in time or escape to use its power, could only endure as it crashed down from thousands of kilometers. This showed just how powerful the protagonist's magic was. Despite challenges with distance, size, and height, nothing could stop the strength and might of his golem warrior and the colossal apple tree. The dragon, bound by the tree, lay motionless in his garden, and the protagonist seemed to have become a dragon slayer. Exhausted yet elated, he knew he had succeeded, finally defeating the Dragon King. Sakura clapped her hands joyfully, continuously praising him for always being so impressive. Witnessing the might of a giant golem warrior, Princess Danae was surprised to tears, not understanding why she was crying, but surely it was because she was too worried for the warrior and too moved by his having saved her and the entire kingdom of Prussia. The princess could hardly believe that the legendary white dragon had been defeated, something no one had ever accomplished before, and now it had happened right before her eyes. She had spent her life training to become stronger and had summoned the protagonist to enhance her own strength and help the country. Then, suddenly, a house had appeared deep in the forest, undeniable proof of what he had done for the nation. She felt truly grateful, but also frustrated, wondering if she would have been stronger if he hadn't been there. Danae placed her hand on her chest, feeling her heartbeat becoming clearer and stronger, stirred by new emotions as she witnessed his power. The princess smiled, thinking how wonderful he was. Looking at the battlefield before him, the protagonist sighed with a headache, as the place had again become a chaotic mess, and even his house had been scorched. Sakura asked if he planned to plant more apples, to which he smiled and said of course. He still needed defenses, even though it didn't seem like the dragons would continue attacking them. Above, the dragons, seeing him look this way, panicked and fled in fear, doubting how a human could defeat the Dragon King, and then calling each other to flee in chaos. Luckily they ran away, or he would have run out of magic to keep fighting. He then approached the dragon, unsure what to do with it. The white dragon, after a moment of silence, asked him to kill it since it was trapped. The soldiers had fled, and it had no magic left to fight back, so he might as well end it. He quietly asked why he should kill it, noting that killing it right there would only make his yard even messier. Thinking it through, the dragon decided it would be neater to shrink itself, and in a flash, it glowed and transformed back into its human form. He was shocked because he had not expected that it was Hesti, the small girl who often played with him, and was his closest family. He was both astonished and embarrassed as he yelled out Hesti's name, seeing her standing naked, introducing herself as the White-Fire Dragon King, or now perhaps the former Dragon King. He was tired, thinking that after all, she had been more open than the other dragons and had impressively parried his attacks. Hesti collapsed to the ground and urged him to kill her, as was his initial intention to end the fight. Confused, he asked why he should kill her, why she had attacked him in the place where they had first met. He grabbed a blanket to cover Hesti, telling her that if they could resolve their issues, there was no reason for her to die. She pondered for a moment, then explained that she had to fight to show the other dragons that he was the strongest. Perplexed, he sighed and asked Hesti if she had accomplished her goal. She replied that she had, but the dragons would have died trying to fight him, so to ensure their safety, she wanted him to take her head to the foolish dragons who had thought of challenging him to ensure they wouldn't try it. She tilted her head towards him, indicating that he should carry out her request. The protagonist remained silent and then suddenly slapped her head hard. Hesti cried out in shock, but he remained quiet and declared that it was her punishment, a lesson she needed to learn. The swelling would not last if it wasn't painful, he said, smiling warmly, stating he would forgive Hesti. He couldn't bring himself to kill her. Her actions all had their reasons, so he returned all the trouble she had caused him. Hesti anxiously mentioned that this was not the way of the dragons. He sighed in response that if she needed help, she should just ask him. He wanted her to tell him whenever she had a problem, explaining that it was normal for close friends to rely on one another. If Hesti was in trouble, he would help, and if he needed help, she could assist him. He mentioned that he didn't have any neighbors, so such interactions were rare for him, suggesting that they could discuss these matters even if he couldn't help, but could still listen to her. It seemed they had made a mess of the place, and the protagonist wanted to start cleaning up immediately. Hesti, moved by a moment of emotion, happily agreed and suggested they clean up together. From a hidden corner, Dionea peered out and couldn't see the white dragon anymore. She thought she might be seeing things, but she still had to inform everyone that the protagonist had defeated it. Then she quickly teleported away. In Sakura's memories from 50 years ago, the silhouette of a man appeared in front of a huge sakura tree, declaring he would build a house there. After the house was completed, his son brought his wife to live there. He introduced his child to the house, speaking of its central pillar, and from there, Sakura was born. Sakura's vague memories start from this moment. The couple had a son, and everything in her memories became clear when he was born. It was the first time Sakura was aware, and somehow, she and he were the same age. As he grew up, so did she. But sadly, he couldn't see her, because she was just the spirit of the house. One day, it rained heavily, but the young man had not returned. Sakura was worried about where he had gone, and loneliness and fear began to overwhelm her. Sakura realized she was about to disappear and screamed that she didn't want to die, but no one responded. Suddenly, a young man appeared, opened the door, and called her home. His cheerful and innocent smile made her cry with joy and happiness. As soon as Sakura saw him, she knew she had been saved. From then on, she always followed his footsteps, watching every stage of his growth, always by his side at every step. And now, as he stood before Sakura, able to hear and see her with affectionate eyes, and share confidences with her, Sakura was completely content and happy to have met him and become an important part of his life. Everyone continued cleaning up the battlefield even as it grew dark, as the task of clearing and repairing took a lot of time and effort. The protagonist noticed that Hesti seemed irritated and asked what was wrong. She complained that he had broken the scepter. He quickly explained that it had cracked during the battle, perhaps because he had concentrated a lot of magic to unleash his attack spells, making it susceptible to breaking. Hesti, puzzled, thought that she had put a lot of effort into making it, and even when she hit it with a hammer, it hadn't been scratched. The protagonist was surprised that such a small girl could create such a powerful weapon. Proudly, Hesti mentioned that she even received a certification in weapon crafting, which was very useful for earning money while traveling. Hesti had even named that skill of hers. He was impressed by her vast experience and asked if she needed a job, thinking he might soon run into trouble if he couldn't create those golems himself. Hesti quickly took the scepter from him, stating it could be fixed. She examined it seriously and said it could be repaired in a day, and she could also take additional materials from her tail. He worried if that was okay since it was part of her body. Hesti responded that although it was as valuable as a dragon's claw, it would grow back over time. Excitedly, she mentioned she had been advised to help her neighbors, so she decided to assist him. The protagonist gratefully thanked Hesti for her help, telling her to let him know if she needed anything. Hesti fell silent, pondering for a moment, then softly said that she no longer had anywhere to live, as being defeated by him meant losing her title, and the dragons only obey those with power. Even if Hesti returned, she would be considered dead to them. Sadly, she mentioned that if he couldn't offer her a place to stay, she would just camp somewhere. But there would be dangers like wild animals and traps, so she might not be able to sleep. The protagonist confidently thought that surely nothing out there could defeat her. But Hesti had destroyed the surrounding area, and she didn't want that to happen again, making it seem like the new Hesti was the real danger out there. He turned back and playfully asked Sakura what she thought. It seemed they could read each other's minds. Sakura smiled joyfully and told him that living with Hesti would be wonderful. Assuming she belonged to him, she would follow any decision he made. Then, he extended his hand to Hesti, offering her to stay with him and Sakura, agreeing that she could have her own house within their home. Hesti shyly smiled and shook his hand in gratitude. And just like that, they had a new tenant. Suddenly, from a distance, someone was seen hurrying over. It was Dionea, the princess of the Kingdom of Prussia. She arrived and stated that she needed him to come to the city immediately because the princess thought she owed him a great favor. It was an unexpected invitation from the Princess of Prussia, needing him to accompany her to the city because the people of the kingdom wanted to officially acknowledge his victory over the White Dragon King, so he was invited to the castle. He wondered if this was some sort of event, seeing her dressed in her princess attire. Danae, embarrassed, replied that she had to dress this way because she was royalty. He was puzzled why he was being praised, feeling he had done nothing worthy of such a claim. The princess firmly stated that he was the victor and the hero of the kingdom. His battle could be seen from the city and everyone, including her, saw him as their savior. The princess did not need to fight, so they wanted to express their gratitude to him. Truthfully, the protagonist did not want to go as it was already late, and he had had a quite exhausting day. Danae mentioned that this was the best reason for him to come to the city with his limited magic power. Even now, his magical strength was still very powerful, but could be temporarily accepted. Danae pleaded that it would not take much of his time, and if his power restored to normal, it could also impact the people in the city. Reluctantly agreeing, he reminded Sakura that he would be back soon for dinner. Hesty clung to his clothes, insisting she wanted to come along as she needed a few things for the staff. Danae screamed in fear, unsure which child was wielding such terrifying power, clearly feeling the surge of magic from the staff before her. He explained that the girl just lived nearby before getting ready to follow the princess to the kingdom, and Hesty quickly handed the staff back to Sakura before following him. Danae then used teleportation magic to bring the three of them to the kingdom of Prussia. Before him stood thousands of nobles and high-level adventurers cheering for him as their hero and savior. Danae mentioned that the Dragon King was only a few kilometers from the city and most had resigned themselves to their fate, not expecting to still be alive and gathered here. He thought to himself that the Dragon King was actually standing right next to Danae. Overhearing their conversation, the little girl asked for permission to go and gather materials. The protagonist quickly urged Hesty to hurry to avoid this awkward situation. Princess Danae continued to lead him to the start of the ceremony, which happened quicker than expected, so to keep up the pace, they would have a small ceremony involving the princess, the protagonist, and the chief knight. The chief knight introduced himself as Okudo, the leader of the magical knight squad. They shook hands and chatted amiably, but suddenly Okudo's hand began to tremble, his face contorted as if he was enduring severe pain. Danae, seeing his expression, guessed that the chief knight had been overwhelmed by his magic during their handshake. Moments later, Okudo, in shock, stood up firmly and said he wasn't worthy to stand there and suggested he should leave the ceremony. Danae hesitated, saying they should start the ceremony, but first she wanted to know his name, her eyes gleaming with anticipation to know the name of her beloved. Surprised he hadn't yet introduced himself, he smiled and said his name was Daichi. The princess was deeply moved by the beautiful name, determined to etch it deep into her heart. In the grand and majestic kingdom of Prussia, Princess Danae had prepared a reward for Daichi's victory. In front of everyone present, the princess read a proclamation praising him and asked Daichi to accept the reward as a token of gratitude from the people of the kingdom. Daichi, feeling awkward, admitted that he hadn't done this for the recognition, and upon seeing the amount of gold and silver and the written rewards, he felt overwhelmed. He was not interested in any material possessions listed, but it would be improper not to accept them. Princess Danae, lifting her skirt slightly, performed a courtesy and invited Daichi to join a feast in his honor. Outside, numerous nobles and high-level adventurers were shouting, eager to see their savior and hear him recount the tale of slaying the White Dragon King. Daichi was becoming tired and bothered by this fuss, thinking he wasn't cut out for such events, and decided to ask Danae for permission to go home. The princess and the chief knight were taken aback, unable to understand why he would decline the royal feast, where the kingdom's finest chefs had prepared exquisite and luxurious dishes for him. Daichi thought of Sakura, who was happily cooking at home, and candidly stated that he already had the best chef at home, and that dinner was nearly ready, making him eager to return home to be with Sakura. Danae, bewildered, realized there was no way to stop him from leaving, felt embarrassed, and expressed her desire to accompany him as it was quite a long and dark journey. Before she could finish, Hesty appeared and announced that she had found everything needed to repair the magic staff. Hesty told Daichi they could leave right away. Daichi, concerned, told Hesty that he was planning to walk home since it was a long way, and he wasn't sure if she would be comfortable. Hearing this, Hesty quickly came up with an idea, closed her eyes, and used her magic to transform into the appearance of a white dragon, cheerfully suggesting that he could ride on her back and fly home. In an instant, everyone was in a panic, fainting in shock at the sudden appearance of the White Dragon King. With the princess trembling, unable to believe that the White Dragon King could be commanded by Daichi, anxious and having forgotten this vital matter, Daichi realized his carelessness had only made things more chaotic. It seemed the only option was to flee the kingdom as soon as possible, before the nobles and high-level adventurers outside discovered what was happening. In a kingdom deemed absolutely safe, the sudden appearance of a formidable Dragon King terrified everyone in the room, making them scream in fear that the protagonist intended to destroy the city. Daichi quickly waved his hands, jokingly explaining that they would neither destroy nor harm the city in any way, turning to Hesti to confirm this. Hesti shook her head, affirming that they would not destroy anything or harm anyone here. Dainea breathed a sigh of relief, but she didn't want Daichi to leave so abruptly without having a chance to confess her feelings. Therefore, the princess called him back, tightly holding his hand and saying she had spoken on behalf of the city, but Daichi also had her personal gratitude. Daichi responded that he couldn't remember doing anything for her specifically but suggested she keep this help to herself until he did something worthy of it. Dainea remained silent, quietly watching him turn and walk away. Daichi climbed onto the back of the white dragon and told Hesti that he had been worried when she began to transform. But she was much smaller than before, probably because her magic had not fully recovered, making it easier to compress her body to maintain the magical density. Daichi gently gripped Hesti's scales and turned to wave goodbye to the princess. Instantly, the White Dragon King soared towards an exit that did not lead to where the crowd was gathered outside but rather to where a few guards were stationed. The guards panicked for a moment, then thought they must have been mistaken, not really having seen a dragon flash by. It was a dreamlike, beautiful scene as the duo flew briskly across the star-filled night sky, quickly moving far from the kingdom. The White Dragon King soared through the city, its form stark against the dark backdrop of the night sky. Some people glanced up at just the right moment to see the dragon speeding faster than the wind, while others blamed their visions on the alcohol, claiming it was all a hallucination. However, the dragon had indeed flown from the castle deep into the forest. At the same time, a mysterious woman looked up to the sky and smiled, softly calling out "Little Sister," as she watched the figures of a man and a dragon. After arriving home, Hesti rubbed her eyes, feeling quite tired from the day and ready to sleep immediately. They wished each other a good night and went their separate ways. When Daichi reached his house, Sakura hurried out to greet him. Knowing he was tired from the day's events, she still hoped he would have dinner, or perhaps restore his magic with her. Embarrassed, Sakura's face turned bright red, and she was too shy to speak. Daichi thought she was adorable, and suggested that they eat dinner first to avoid the food getting cold, and then they could focus on restoration afterwards. He truly loved this simple yet endearing life. Everything quieted down as another night passed. Sakura was pouring tea for Daichi, the fragrant aroma and the steam from the cup creating a dreamy, intimate atmosphere. Sakura wanted to ask him something about the house. Confused, Daichi didn't understand what she meant by commenting on the house. She explained that seeing Hesti's attack made her think its structure was not quite right, especially since Hesti's fire seemed to nearly bring the house down. Daichi wondered what they should do to fix this issue. Sakura placed her hand on her chest and suggested that if he used her body and all her magical power, they could synchronize and attempt to repair it. He proposed that they go outside to get a better view of the house, which would help him visualize it more clearly. Closing his eyes, he placed his hands on her shoulders to begin synchronization. The system was showing them a complete model of the house, and all that remained was for him to use magic and intuition to move it. Daichi started with a small trial, closing his eyes and imagining moving one floor of the building 5 meters to the side, followed by a controlled collapse. Suddenly, that floor shook violently and then swiftly shifted to one side. Sakura, excited, praised him for being so capable. It had indeed moved, and Daichi grasped the method quickly, just as she had hoped. Daichi thought she was overpraising him. He found it not too difficult, but was worried that the house would quickly collapse. Sakura reassured him that since they had synchronized their magic to reinforce the walls, nothing bad would happen. She laughed and continued to say that the important thing was to get used to it, then urged him to keep practicing. 10 minutes later, the house had transformed completely from its original state into a magnificent structure. Daichi couldn't believe his eyes. He found magic truly incredible, allowing him to easily change the shape of the house, as if playing a building game with bricks. Additionally, as long as the mass didn't change, the house could be reshaped. Sakura wholeheartedly praised the master of the house for being able to change its shape so many times in such a short period. Daichi had understood how to move it, and now it was time to change its shape. The structure of the house was somewhat fragile on the sides, and he wanted it to be more stable. The garden with a large apple orchard allowed Daichi to expand the house to some extent. Shortly after, a pyramid appeared in the vast garden, topped with a small house. It turned out that seeking absolute safety meant turning it into a pyramid. And as usual, the top still featured the small house with 2 rooms separated from the dining room and kitchen. Daichi thought he had made a mistake, but Sakura comforted him, saying this was the best answer for safety. Even now Hesti could hit it with her body and leave no trace. Although that was true, Daichi was still frustrated because he did not want to turn his and Sakura's house into a crude shape. Sakura was very happy to hear Daichi say this. She shyly mentioned that she would continue to expand, and over time, she would achieve the shape he desired. Daichi smiled and continued working towards his design, a method that also helped make his house more robust. That night, next to Daichi's pyramid, a young girl named Hesti was diligently repairing his staff. Wearing protective glasses, she continuously hammered the staff. After a while, she lifted it up, inspected it seriously, and then, removing her glasses, she smiled with satisfaction, having finally completed the repairs. The next morning, Daichi and Sakura stood admiring their majestic house atop the pyramid. Though Daichi still felt that the shape wasn't quite right, Sakura suggested that since the old shape of the house was stored in Daichi's memory, it could be restored if they synchronize, allowing for adjustments. While they were chatting animatedly, a gentle breeze brought Hesti to them. She was startled that Daichi had used magic in such an unusual way again, feeling the magical change from the previous day, but not expecting Daichi to have employed it like that. Hesti remarked that a normal person would have collapsed from using such a potent magical energy even once. Holding up the newly repaired staff proudly in front of them, she explained that it would be easier for Daichi to use. Daichi excitedly accepted the staff, not forgetting to praise Hesti's excellent craftsmanship. The new staff was thicker and more robust than the old one, thanks to Hesti's careful selection of materials and her isolated efforts to construct it, which required more research than other projects. Daichi continuously thanked Hesti, who explained that using a magic key, Daichi could now change the shape of the house much more easily. Sakura added that it might be even more successful if synchronized with her, and once the shape was set, it could be altered immediately. Daichi quickly understood and started the process immediately. After synchronizing with Sakura and using the staff, Daichi transformed the pyramid into a regular tower. He looked up at his work happily, while Hesti was endlessly impressed, amazed that someone could achieve this on their first try. After a few more attempts, Hesti worriedly asked Daichi to hand over the staff for inspection. She was satisfied this time, as she had managed very carefully to ensure it wouldn't break, then returned it to him. Daichi beamed, telling Hesti that the staff was quite sturdy and it helped him feel less exhausted as it saved him energy. After many attempts to alter its form, the house had grown increasingly imposing. Sakura mentioned that at this rate, he could do it without synchronization. Daichi laughed, crediting the staff for conserving his magical power. That was how the protagonist's house became easier to remodel. Deep in the forest, a sudden roar from Daichi was heard as he was creating a robust army of golems, whose bodies resembled humans, but whose faces were somewhat off. Daichi figured the issue must be due to losing some details, while creating several golems at once, which is why their faces had issues. Princess Dionea, from a distance, screamed out of concern as she sensed the immense magic Daichi used but couldn't control herself. Trembling with fear, yet she still greeted him. Daichi reluctantly complimented her control, noting that Dionea always appeared when he was working, so being affected by such strong magic was inevitable. The princess proudly stated that he needn't worry about that since she had taken the necessary precautions and felt she had grown a lot. Daichi wondered what brought the princess there today, and she replied that she was there to grant him a piece of land and a title within the city. Then, she handed him the certificate and told him to use them as he wished. She inquired about the menacing appearance of the golems, as Dionea could feel intense pressure when they looked at her. Daichi thanked her for the certificate, then retracted the golems back to their original form. Dionea gasped, exclaiming that it must be the magic key technology. She knew about it, as it was a very convenient magic spell. Even a great sorceress like Danae could only use one or two phrases at most. Disappointed because Daichi had succeeded and surpassed her once again, Princess Danae wondered how he had learned such magic. Daichi responded that he had been taught by a young girl who just passed by. Danae became curious about who this girl could be to know such magic. Before Daichi could introduce her, Hesti walked out with a sleepy face, heard the noise, and asked if there was someone outside. When she saw her, the princess gasped in shock, exclaiming that he had been taught by the Dragon King, which was unbelievable. It was hard to imagine that the legendary sorcerer was just another alias for the White Fire Dragon King. A few decades ago, an unknown sorceress dressed in black appeared at the Prussian Magic Association. In just a few days, she attained the highest rank and then vanished, leaving behind legendary records under the name Hesti Radona. The name was slightly different, specifically the last sound in Hesti's name, as she had used a pseudonym. Other dragons could easily guess her pseudonym along with her black hair and clothes. Hesti pointed at Daichi and said if he thought she was a legend, she was nothing now. If he went to the Magic Association, they couldn't even measure Daichi because he far exceeded the normal levels, something close to a legend. But that sim became inappropriate, and they couldn't assign a fitting rank for Daichi. The princess said she had met someone much stronger than herself some time ago, so she thought she was getting used to it. It was time for Danae to return to the kingdom. She quickly said goodbye and promised to do her best to become as strong as them. Daichi and Hesti returned to their work of creating golems and developing them before night fell. Night fell, and Danae was working at full capacity at her desk. The bright light made the long pile of neatly arranged papers on the desk gradually become more visible. She was tired from too much work, and many people had panicked thinking the city was under attack, so she had to issue a new announcement. Fortunately, at least Danae wouldn't have to stay up all night, and thanks to Daichi's magic, this season's harvest was unprecedentedly fruitful. She dreamily remembered Daichi and wondered when she would see him again. Lost in thought, she was suddenly interrupted by the chief knight knocking and entering her room, bringing up the issue of emergency forces from the central city. While not necessary, the princess was still grateful for their help, which included some adventurers, most of whom had returned. But a few lingered behind seeking treasure around the city. Danae guessed that these adventurers didn't want to return empty-handed. With many dungeons around the city, the chief knight believed they didn't want to waste a week without earnings. She had ordered them to stay away from Daichi's forest, but it seemed they ignored it, and the situation was getting worse. Although Daichi wouldn't have any trouble dealing with them, and certainly wouldn't kill them, he preferred peace, and their disturbance would affect him. She thought she should prepare an apology in advance in case that happened, and if so, it would also give her a reason to return there. Thinking this, Danae couldn't help but smile happily. Moreover, a delegation was preparing to arrive from the city, wanting to closely examine the repelling of the dragon. They even had someone who could detect any strong magic, surely having heard rumors about the hero Daichi. The princess, determined and annoyed, declared that if they intended to attack Daichi's house, she would stop them by force if necessary. Danae suspected that it was highly likely that the adventurers or the delegation would cause trouble for them, which was too much to handle, and would definitely require the assistance of the chief knight and the royal army. The next morning, in the forest, the group of adventurers was rampantly marauding, soaring like birds of prey in search of their quarry in the morning. They had spotted Daichi's house, a wicked smile appearing on their faces. A battle was surely about to unfold. It was uncertain whether this time Daichi would gain the upper hand and emerge victorious. The steps of the predators approached, swiftly advancing to raid the protagonist's house. Before they had gone far, one of the group began to show strange symptoms, suddenly vomiting violently before collapsing unconscious. The others screamed in fear about magical shock. The one called the leader, holding a knife in panic, exclaimed why someone so powerful lived here. He then saw a small hut, which was actually Hesti's house, and ordered his group to take cover there and regroup. As they moved, they saw a vague figure approaching them. Hesti came out and wondered aloud who these people were. They panicked, wondering why a child was here, emitting the powerful magic of the White Dragon King. Naively, Hesti thought she should stop them and pointed at them, issuing a warning that enraged them. However, they suddenly couldn't move, and after she said a word to blow them away, they were instantly swept away by a strong gust of wind. They started to fearfully inform each other to be careful, realizing she was a high-level sorceress, while Hesti hesitated, unsure whether to incinerate them or not. As they sensed the attack had stopped and signaled each other to advance, they encountered a golem guarding the garden. The golem's fierce face was terrifying, and it moved on its own. Confident that it was just a wooden golem and would be easily defeated, they approached and struck it. But instead of damaging the golem, the blow threw him back violently. The golem was so hard that his sword couldn't even scratch it, prompting the bandits to quickly flee. Inside the house, Daichi was washing his face when he suddenly heard the commotion outside. Sakura quickly explained that a band of robbers had arrived that morning, and she didn't know how he wanted to handle them, so she handed him the staff to deal with them himself. He took the staff and synchronized with Sakura. Outside was chaos. The robbers repeatedly encountered problems on the protagonist's land and were soon surrounded by golems on all sides. The robbers were so terrified, they fainted right in front of his house. Therefore, Daichi didn't even need to act as the robbers fainted from fear, saving him from using magic or harming anyone. Daichi and Sakura leisurely went for breakfast, while Hesti was still unsure how to handle the robbers. The golems surrounded the robbers on all sides, causing them to kneel in terror and beg Daichi for mercy. The protagonist wanted to ask them a few questions and demanded that they explain everything, which the robbers did, nodding and responding faintly. Daichi asked for the name of their leader, who replied that they were adventurers from the central city, and their group was called the Lightblade Brigade, summoned to help fight a dragon because they didn't want to return empty-handed. The leader continued, saying they were sent here because their headquarters told them to. They also mentioned a black-haired woman who sent them, telling them that there were many treasures here. Daichi wondered if there were treasures around here, to which he replied that there were only a few magic ore veins, nothing else, and he vehemently denied that they had touched them, saying they didn't expect anyone to be living here, especially someone as strong as him. The group then earnestly apologized. Daichi didn't think they were lying. It seemed they weren't targeting him. He understood the robbers' story, but still disliked that they were causing a disturbance here, uninvited and armed. The robbers thought to shave their heads as penance, and others were about to take their swords to their hair when Daichi quickly stopped them, knowing just how troublesome it was to manage hair. Daichi continued, saying since they hadn't damaged anything, he would forgive them as long as they did not attack his home again, and reminded them to tell everyone that there was no treasure here. The robbers were profoundly grateful and profusely thanked him. He wondered who the black-haired woman was that wanted to attack his house. Daichi didn't know what they wanted, but it seemed these men were just being manipulated. They quickly gathered their belongings, then stood up straight and saluted Daichi, who sighed in relief, finally enjoying some peace. However, he wondered about the central city and what might be going on there. He asked Hesti about the central city. Hesti agreed but then pointed to the sky and said he had a visitor. Looking up, Daichi saw a majestic dragon soaring above him. Daichi initially thought the dragon had come for Hesti, but in reality, it had come for him. Daichi wondered what the dragon wanted from him, to which it replied that it would descend for easier communication, asking if that would be agreeable to the former and current king it addressed. The dragon gracefully landed before Daichi, Sakura, and Hesti, expressing gratitude for being allowed in Daichi's presence. The dragon thought it rude to converse in the dragon language, so it transformed into a human, specifically the former second-in-command to Hesti. In this form, it could interact more effectively. It continued, admitting it wasn't very skilled at transforming into a human form. After reaching 100 years, dragons proficient in magic could learn to transform into humans, though it wasn't common. Those who lived too long could lose their wisdom and revert to simple beasts. Daichi, puzzled, asked if dragons age, to which Hesti confirmed they do, but not to worry, as if they become a threat, other dragons will deal with them. The former commander added that there were cases where some survived, but most would slowly perish or be killed by other creatures. Dragon society was indeed harsh. The protagonist inquired why he had come, and the former commander replied they were there to meet their new king. And because he could transform into a human and had the smallest human form, he was chosen as the representative. The former commander bowed solemnly to greet Daichi, then pointed to the sky, indicating that the rest were waiting above. Daichi looked up and saw a group of dragons flying nearby. The dragons were surprised that a human like Daichi could speak their language, something that usually took humans decades to achieve. They initially had a dismissive attitude towards him, but upon seeing this, the former commander sternly glanced at them, and they quieted down and listened. As he was about to call the dragons down to show respect to Daichi, Daichi said it was not necessary as they could not all descend. On behalf of the other dragons, the former commander conveyed their greetings to Daichi. solemnly vowing loyalty to him from that moment onward. All the dragons bowed their heads, signaling their intent to obey any command from Daichi. Daichi humbly mentioned that the dragons should not come close to the city, as the people there had been very frightened the last time they visited. The dragons agreed, signaling to each other to depart, and the former commander once again thanked Daichi for allowing them to live under his rule, saying that they would be ready to assist with their strength whenever he needed. Daichi scratched his head, wondering if there would ever be a time when he might need their combat abilities. The commander noted Daichi's kindness in not killing Hesti, stating that such mercy alone was enough to earn their loyalty and respect. Daichi thought that it seemed like Hesti was greatly cherished by the dragons. She once claimed they didn't need her, but perhaps Hesti had underestimated their feelings for her. Hearing the former commander Genryu address her as Sir, Hesti felt awkward and thought he didn't need to be so formal. Genryu, shocked, responded that it was necessary as she had led these dragons well and deserved respect. There was another matter Genryu wanted to discuss with Hesti. The Black Dragon King was on the move, and he could sense their distinct magical aura. He quickly said his farewells and transformed back into a dragon to fly away. With so much happening today and Hesti feeling tired, she couldn't stop yawning and eventually dozed off. Daichi mentioned that the sun was shining and everything was peaceful again, so they might as well take a nap. Thus, the two leaned against a tree and slept until Sakura called them for dinner. Finally, a peaceful day for the protagonist unfolded. He was assigning tasks to a golem to take care of the apple trees. Suddenly, Hesti appeared with a paper, asking Daichi if he was free, as she needed to discuss the central city after the adventurer's visit. Being the provider of information made Daichi very grateful and appreciative of her. Hesti modestly said she did it merely to repay a debt she owed. She briskly unfolded a map, different from the previous one, leaving Daichi wondering just how many maps she had. Hesti had traveled the world, so she owned many maps and had numerous backups, as transforming into a dragon could easily destroy them. Pointing at the map, Hesti continued. To the south of the magical forest lies the central city, built on a plain and surrounded by the territories of the Black Dragon King. The forest wolves, ogres, goblins, orcs, and several other species. Daichi, puzzled, asked why it was built in such a place if it was surrounded by so many different tribes. Hesti explained that there is a dungeon in the center of the city that produces magical ore, and eventually, people would gather there, equip themselves, and launch expeditions to mine it. Raiding the dungeon has become the city's main industry, which is very efficient as the magical ores are inexhaustible, and other species can also harvest them. It turns out the dungeon is a magical point, yet it's not as effective and concentrated as in this forest. Some violent species have settled near the city, but human weaponry is quite strong, making it a city for those who want to live wildly or enjoy manual labor. Hesti thought Daichi could become very wealthy, but even if he did, he wouldn't know what to spend the money on. Daichi asked if Hesti needed money, noting that while it's not necessary for survival, it could buy many things like tools for making magical staffs. Daichi said if she ever needed money, she should tell him, and he would give it to her. Hesti was surprised, commenting that high-quality materials are costly, and if the material is compatible with her bone structure, the price could multiply significantly. Thus, the protagonist found a new way to invest. Back in the Kingdom of Prussia, the chief knight informed Princess Dionea that the representative from the central city had arrived. Dionea instructed to let them in. The doors opened to reveal a woman with long black hair, who introduced herself as Antidora, the deputy commander serving under the supreme commander of the central city. The princess introduced herself as Dionea Medicine, serving as the representative of this city, and the two shook hands, pleased to meet each other. Anne smiled mysteriously and said, as expected from the second princess of the supreme sorceress Dionea, her hands were very soft. Princess Dionea had recently heard rumors of a high-level personnel change there, but it was surprising that a high-ranking member of the central city was such a beautiful person. When Dionea inquired why Anne had come to the royal capital, Anne replied that rumors had circulated that Prussia had tamed a white dragon, and she couldn't stay away upon hearing such news. She wanted to verify the story, so she came to the royal capital. Anne expressed her desire to meet the White Dragon King. Dionea internally remarked on the oddity of the fascination, especially since the creature supposedly in question was not present. The royal capital had endured numerous dragon attacks, and Anna's side had sent reinforcements to help, a fact Dionea couldn't deny or fail to repay. Anne continued, saying she had also heard that Danae had personally taken down a dragon in the magical forest and hoped that Danae could guide her there. The princess was suspicious of the motives of the woman before her, puzzled why Anne knew about that place, telling her that she did not encourage anyone to venture into that dangerous forest. However, despite Danae's worried expression, Anne was quite calm, raising her arm and asserting her own strength. The princess understood this from their handshake, but also had to consider Daichi. It would be troubling if Anne caused a disturbance and upset him. After some thought, Danae agreed to lead Anne to the forest, where tactics for dealing with dragons could also be discussed. As it was getting late, Danae excused herself, suggesting they resume their discussion in the morning, planning to conclude by introducing balance points and teaching methods to combat monsters. That was the plan, depending also on Danae's acting skills. While Anne was visiting Danae, Daichi and Hesti continued their own discussion about magic. Hesti handed him a new staff, mentioning it was a backup prototype she had made to get started. Daichi praised her skill at having made it so quickly and being able to complete it in such a short time. Hesti mentioned that she was very skilled at making staffs, and this time she used materials from her travels. Nonetheless, it was just a prototype. Daichi wondered if it was okay to use, but Hesti wasn't concerned as she could always buy more during her shopping trips nearby. After all, she had already received money from him and could spend it freely. He heartily praised her, saying it was just as expected from a dragon who had traveled the world. She even knew the best places to purchase the necessary materials. Hesti happily replied that she had tried using the horn of an immortal unicorn from far away, hence the high durability. Daichi immediately tried it out, creating a golem, but as he recited the spell, the staff exploded into hundreds of pieces. He stared in disbelief at the scene before him. Hesti, dejected, said she would make another, suggesting that perhaps she had focused too much on durability and it lacked flexibility. It seemed that Hesti's alchemist spirit was ignited, and Daichi guessed that the stock for his staffs would significantly increase from this point onward. Back in the kingdom of Prussia, the defeated adventurers were having a light-hearted drink together. The leader was contentedly satisfied because he had survived after facing someone as formidable as Daichi. A subordinate, holding a glass of liquor, commented that it seemed their boss had quickly gotten over the previous day's events, ever since that landlord-looking guy had scared him half to death. The leader vehemently denied it, saying it wasn't just shock but real fear. He was so agitated that he stood up abruptly, exclaiming that Daichi was terrifying, and even when they had withdrawn their weapons, they couldn't stand a chance against him. Despite being high-level adventurers, they were treated like children and let go unharmed, which was not just about heroism. Although they were captured, Daichi didn't take anything from them, not even the leader's brand-name sword, which was worth more than a house. He didn't even glance at it. Such a combination of strength and kindness was rare, and now the leader and his followers were determined and ready to fight for Daichi if he ever asked. The group shifted their discussion to the mysterious long-haired woman who supposedly owned a strange and powerful shop. They speculated that she might not be from the central city, but soon they dropped the subject and continued their night of revelry. In the magical forest, the echoing calls of night birds accompanied the figures of Princess Danae and Anne as they moved forward, becoming clearer in the dim light. The dragons nesting here were often those beginning to age, and the central city was also very cautious about this forest, which Anne had studied extensively. She knew there was a dragon valley deep inside, and something about Anne's expression hinted at a mysterious agenda that Danae couldn't quite grasp. Danae felt that Anne was not adequately armed to take down any dragons, realizing the woman before her, though young, had risen to the position of deputy commander of the central city, and any carelessness in revealing unnecessary secrets could spell major trouble. Today, Danae planned to show Anne the nests from a distance and explain some methods for dealing with them, then return to the castle. That was the best scenario, and the most important thing to remember was not to cause any trouble for Daichi, ensuring that at least that minimum was met. Everything was going according to plan, and the princess prayed that no complications would arise. Suddenly, Anne had a question for Danae. She mentioned that something was approaching them from behind. The silhouette of a large beast, its body resembling melting mud, loomed closer, opening its mouth and raising its arms as if to attack them. Anne identified it as a mud-black golem, something she had never seen before. Princess Danae readied her staff, assuming a defensive stance. Meanwhile, Daichi was finishing some fine-tuning. The house looked quite decent after he had spent the morning adjusting it. Previously, it had resembled a miniature model, but now it had taken on more of a castle-like appearance. Daichi glanced over and noticed Hesty getting ready to go somewhere. Upon asking, he learned that she was planning a trip to the city to buy materials for making magical staffs with the money he had given her the day before. She mentioned it would only take a little while, and once back, she would start making the staffs immediately, so Hesty asked him to wait just a bit longer. Shortly afterward, Hesty hurried toward the city. At that speed, it seemed impossible for her journey to be brief. Sakura mentioned that because Hesty had said even in human form she could still use some dragon power, she might speed up later. Daichi had also seen Hesty move at an astonishing speed before, confirming she was still very strong even in human form, so there was no need to worry too much about her. The two then chatted about their breakfast. Today, Sakura had prepared delicious seasoned rice balls for him to provide energy and keep Daichi in good spirits. While Daichi and Sakura were enjoying their delicious rice balls, suddenly the trees in the forest started moving abruptly, and they could hear a loud scream of a girl. Princess Dionea, terrified, ran towards him, accompanied by a woman with long black hair, followed by a menacing monster made of black mud chasing them. Daichi was worried, unsure what was happening and confused about the identity of the woman with Dionea. Angrily, he confronted the princess for entering his garden without permission. Dionea, in a panic, apologized as they were being chased by that strange creature. Although annoyed, Daichi didn't lose his temper and scold her. Instead, he took a deep breath and loudly demanded his peaceful lunchtime back. His powerful shout made the princess stumble, yet Anne managed to withstand it normally. It had been a long time since Dionea had endured such a blow from Daichi, but this time she was more mature and managed to prevent herself from wetting herself in fear. Daichi asked the princess to stop bringing things like dragons and mud puppets to his place. She nervously apologized, explaining it was a strange monster, and they didn't know what else to do but run as fast as they could. Daichi initially thought it was just a puppet, but the princess explained he might be the only one who could deal with it because of its strong defenses. If there were only a few, she could handle them herself, but they were surrounded by more than 10. So they had no choice but to come here after implementing a hit-and-run strategy, and they had managed to disperse most of them, except for the one that followed. It seemed like everything was resolved, so Daichi was willing to overlook it and took the opportunity to ask who this girl was. Despite being hit by his magical whirlwind, she was able to withstand it without being blown away. Dionea quickly introduced her as a guest named Anne, who was still in awe of his magic. Anne's power had even exceeded her imagination, reaching into her brain and leaving her feeling wonderful. Hearing Dionea's voice, Anne quickly regained her composure and introduced herself as Anne Tidora, the deputy commander under the supreme commander of the central city. In front of him, Daichi smiled pleasantly when meeting her, but his thoughts drifted back to the place where the bandits from the previous occasion were. Anne wondered if he was indeed the master of this land filled with magic, noting that they had similar areas within the central city, but none as powerful as this one. Dionea, frightened, wore a look of disbelief, not thinking the two could communicate so freely. Indeed, it was difficult to converse normally with him due to the significant disparity in power, so they usually felt suffocated if they were near him. It must be due to the abilities of the deputy commander of the central city. Anne eagerly asked the princess for permission to talk more with him, unsure if the princess's schedule would allow this. Dionea agreed, but it was unclear if Daichi was okay with it. He responded that since he had just finished eating, they should talk and have tea together. The recent influx of people from the central city had also not been long ago, and he wanted to clarify that matter, and other information would also be very useful. Anne looked forward to talking with Daichi, and so a surprise tea party was organized in his garden. The fragrant tea eased the tense atmosphere. They connected well in conversation, and Daichi learned about Anne, who turned out to be the representative of the central city in collaboration with the royal capital. He asked why the two had come out of the forest and about the monster, as it was also the first time Daichi had seen such a creature. The princess hesitantly replied that it was also her first time seeing this black mud figure, and they were attacked as soon as they entered the forest, so they didn't know where it came from. Seriously speaking, Dionea knew this forest better than Daichi, but this was her first encounter with this monster, suggesting it was newly born from the forest somehow. Daichi's thought was immediately dismissed because there was no black soil in the forest, so it certainly wasn't naturally born. Daichi asked Anne if she knew anything about this, and she candidly replied that the forest was completely new to her, and Dionea was just guiding her for her research. Dionea, in a panic, explained that they were there so she could teach Anne about the methods of dealing with dragons and the magical forest, but she never intended to come to Daichi's house. Suddenly, Anne noticed Daichi's staff and asked if it was a magical staff. Daichi confirmed it was, asking if it looked like something else. Anne said she could feel a dark and powerful energy emanating from it. She asked if she could hold it and feel it herself, as she was very curious about it. After taking the staff, Anne was surprised to declare that it was made from the bone of a dragon king, something she had not seen in a long time. Princess Dionea, hearing that it was a staff of the dragon king, jumped up in fright, her face filled with fear because it was the finest artifact, usually kept in treasure houses, and given to the strongest wizards in times of national disaster. Daichi, bewildered, realized it was that terrifying. Thinking back, he had used it to smash things, so he wondered if he should apologize to its maker. Dionea said she already knew Daichi had a very powerful weapon in his possession. Daichi quickly dismissed it as just a gift. The princess was surprised, but then quickly calmed down, as it was not strange for him to be the recipient of it. Anne, puzzled, asked Dionea why it wasn't strange for him to receive such a powerful gift, and the princess, flustered, didn't know what she was allowed to say and looked to Daichi for help. Daichi cheerfully replied that it was fine, and it wasn't something that harmed him. Dionea explained to Anne that there were others who lived here with Daichi. Before she could finish, Hesti returned, and Anne's face lit up with excitement. Anne called Hesti's sister and quickly ran to hug her tightly, pressing so hard that Hesti could barely breathe. Daichi and Dionea did not understand what was happening. He was clueless. It seemed trouble for a family member had arisen. Hesti, struggling, introduced her as Anteidos Hydora, the Iron Dragon King, whom she had once cared for. Daichi was baffled to see Hesti, who looked like a child, having once looked after Anne, who seemed like an adult. Daichi commented that since Hesti is a Dragon King, her outward appearance might not match her actual age, but he understood that she must be dearly loved. Anne eagerly responded that indeed, Hesti had helped her a great deal, and she became even more excited when Hesti touched her. Daichi, feeling exhausted, thought this was terrible, because he had initially thought Anne was an ordinary person, and whenever he thinks someone is ordinary, they always turn out to be completely the opposite. Like Hesti and Anne, he wondered if his ability to sense normalcy was faulty, or perhaps he should say that it's fortunate these Dragon Kings look like ordinary people. Only Princess Dionea was feeling tired and stressed because the deputy commander of the central city was a Dragon King. Unsure of how she should report this situation, seeming a tough decision for her. It was unusual to see Hesti so flustered and lost, a fascinating contradiction. Daichi told Anne that joking around was all well and good, but not to overdo it, puzzled why a Dragon King would become the deputy commander of the central city. Was Anne planning to take over the city? If so, it was a serious matter, and he didn't want to get involved. Anne quickly denied ever having such intentions. Her main job was just selling goods, and she was just trying to make Hesti happy by creating and selling equipment. But before she realized it, Anne had become the deputy commander. Anne had also become a Dragon King quite unexpectedly, which is normal for someone to rise in rank without noticing. So an ordinary person could indeed become the head of a city, and the central city was good in many ways. However, Hesti was a famous magician, and Anne was the deputy commander of the central city, having too many Dragon Kings living as humans, though it seemed harmless. Hesti described Anne as a hyperactive, serious, almost harmless, and normal child, but that adoration was awful. It made Hesti very tired, and she could continue if not for the tightness in Anne's hug. That explained why Hesti called Anne harmless, so apart from times involving Hesti, she probably really was harmless. After observing for a while, Anne thanked Daichi for the meeting, expressing relief at seeing Hesti and him together. Meeting someone as strong as Daichi is considered lucky among the dragon kind. Anne wished she could keep that strength for herself, but hesitated. Then continued saying she had already taken up too much of his free time today, and thanked him for his hospitality. Right after, she bowed and turned to leave. Dionea couldn't shake off her worries and fears. She muttered that she first needed to ask about Anne's intentions. Hesti seemed dazed, because Anne said she had spent time today, meaning she wanted to return here, implying that many people might come to Daichi's house in the coming time. In Daichi's garden, he and the golems were cleaning up the area after the tea party. They had almost finished cleaning, but it was already dark, and the soil from this black figurine was indeed heavy. Hesty, feeling down, apologized to Daichi because Anne brought a lot of trouble just by being there. Daichi quickly said it wasn't her fault, but that of the black figurines. Hesty grimly explained that this was due to one of Anne's abilities, so it was her fault. It's called ferromagma. Anne releases a mix of rock and metal. The black figurines are made from that stuff, so it turns out this heavy thing contains metal, and he wonders if he could collect this material outside the garden. However, Daichi was still puzzled why it attacked Anne, only to learn that Anne has a habit of attacking herself when she's upset, and it makes her feel better. He worriedly thought what a troublesome dragon king. Hesty didn't think she would do that in the city but was sure to teach Anne to remember this lesson. Daichi told Hesty that with the dragon kind living in human form, wasn't she worried about being exposed? The little girl replied as long as they're in human form, they are nearly impossible to detect. Plus Hesty had already hidden her magic. Other dragon kings often drink and befriend humans, so they feel very free, they want to live happily. And many of them still act on instinct. Hesty reminded Daichi that his magic was leaking, asking if he didn't know how to control it. Daichi replied, as if he couldn't feel the magic leaking at all, saying that he had been living fine with it, but wasn't sure if there would be any problems because of this. Hesty stated that if Daichi were a normal person, he would probably be dead by now. That was true because Daichi also needed magical power to live. Normally, if someone leaked magic to the extent he did, they would likely be dead. He had thought of magic just as a convenient form of power, but its impact on life was quite significant. With the amount of power Daichi possessed, Hesty thought there wouldn't be any problem. However, it might also be attracting monsters. Daichi was surprised, not thinking it could be so harmful. He knew that monsters attacked because this was a magical hotspot, but then realized he himself might also be attracting them. But Daichi's magical attraction was much smaller compared to dragon veins, so Hesty thought they weren't related at all. Hesty suggested there was a way to hide his magic, asking if he wanted to try it. With Daichi's agreement, she approached him, placed her hands on him, and chanted a concealment spell. Immediately, Daichi's body glowed while Hesty transformed back into her dragon form. She had created a link with her magic to conceal his and prevent further leakage, making it appear to ordinary people that Daichi had the magical power of Hesty in dragon form. It felt like his body was reinforced, similar to when he wore the golem wood armor. Lighter than the armor, but feeling weaker. If he trained, he could possibly do it himself. Daichi clenched his hands and chanted the startup spell. Then his body shone brightly. It was a success. Hesty was puzzled how he could do it on his first try. She thought she hadn't been able to teach him properly, feeling somewhat useless. But it seemed like using it daily would be difficult, and wondered if it was hard for Daichi to move so carefully because he was not used to moving in such a restrained way. Hesty explained that it was because Daichi had completely cut off his power source, but cutting off completely could also be beneficial. Except through sight, magic-sensing monsters like the stone golems cannot detect him. However, Hesty suggested that it might be better if Daichi allowed a bit of his magic to leak, because this would prevent him from being underestimated and getting into unnecessary trouble. Hesty mentioned that if it was hard to adjust, Daichi could call her when needed. She was thrilled and felt useful in helping him, thinking that her purpose in life had grown stronger. In the kingdom of Prussia, Princess Danae met Anne to talk. The princess said she was so surprised to learn that Anne was actually a dragon king that her heart nearly leaped out of her chest. Anne sincerely apologized to Danae and promised to be more careful next time, though she feared she might lose her composure again there. Danae wondered if the city's Secretary of Arms was aware. Anne replied that they didn't know, and her being in this situation was just a coincidence. The secretary was also completely unaware that Anne was a dragon king. Anne continued, saying that she usually took on the secretary role because her main job involved security oversight and assisting adventurers. Danae felt relieved that Anne worked for others, so there probably wasn't an issue. And she felt fine as long as the royal capital was well protected. Danae questioned what those black figurines were. If they were a new species, she needed to do something immediately. Anne admitted that she had created them for surveillance because she knew the owner of the dragon vein, Daichi, was very strong, and she couldn't approach him without being killed, so she released the figurine. And Anne also wanted to scout the situation in the magical forest, but it turned out Daichi was a kind-hearted person, so that was pointless. Initially, Danae was also afraid of Daichi, so she understood what Anne was thinking. But Danae just wondered why Anne would attack herself. The confident woman replied that it was her hobby, but she felt even more thrilled creating the figurine. Maybe Anne would use more mud and metal, or perhaps it would be stronger and feel better with Daichi's unimaginable magical power. While discussing, Dionea wanted to inquire about the survey results of the forest. Anne quickly apologized as the findings were worse than she had anticipated. The dungeon under the armed city was expanding further into the forest. This was also the reason why Anne took on the role of deputy secretary of the city, thanks to the dragon vein making the forest around Prussia extremely rich in magic. The dungeon, feeding on this magic, behaved like a living entity, and its arrival here was inevitable. While scouting the capital's surroundings with the figurines, Anne found several vulnerabilities connecting this area to the dungeon. If left unaddressed, it was very likely that monsters would leave the dungeon and gradually surround Prussia. Dionea, tiredly thinking, felt that just as the threat from the dragon kind had been comfortably resolved, now this issue arose. The princess was aware of the dungeon, but not familiar with it, so she asked Anne for more details on how long it would take for the monsters to emerge. Anne explained that the emergence cycle depended on several conditions, so it was impossible to give an exact date, but if the dungeon continued to grow, it could be just a few days. The simplest way to minimize damage was to fight and destroy the monsters, which was the best approach. However, some monsters were already in the armed city and would come here looking for food. Using all her magic, the princess could protect the city with a shield, but she couldn't maintain it for long, and Dionea wasn't sure she could last until all the monsters were defeated. Dionea also thought they didn't need to worry about the forest because the monsters couldn't approach Daichi. Even if there was a dungeon in the forest, it wouldn't matter. The problem was more about city security, and they also needed to prepare contracts to get adventurers to help them, which was a headache. Anne said if Dionea had any questions about the dungeon, she should ask her. Anne was happy to meet her sister again, but couldn't stay together to prevent that, so she had come to the capital. Dionea smiled and told Anne to do her best as the dragon king of the armed city, and they needed to prepare for the battle, determined to come up with a special plan by evening. Today, the weather is beautiful, and atop the highest floor of the skyscraper in the magical garden, Daichi is lounging, contentedly turning over as he remarks how long it's been since he last lay down like this. Sakura gently and elegantly pours Daichi a cup of tea, its fragrant aroma easing him into sleep. Daichi, half asleep, suddenly hears a whooshing sound from the screen. It's Hesti, planning to go into the city to gather materials for a staff, as yesterday he broke the spare one. Yesterday, Daichi built an overly large golem that grew rapidly, damaging the staff again. But Hesti was happy doing it because her magical aura is very distinctive, easily noticeable when she feels joy or happiness. Therefore, Sakura can understand Hesti's feelings. However, Daichi still can't see others' emotions through their aura like Sakura, probably because he doesn't practice, but mainly because his own magical power is too great. Humans need to pay close attention to observe the breathing of small animals, and it's similar with magic. Since Sakura is a house, she is very sensitive to others' emotions. By the way, Daichi asks if Sakura doesn't want to go into the city, and she replies that she's not that interested. Taking care of her master and watching his sleeping face, as well as observing his life, is the happiest thing for her. Daichi smiles happily, pleased that she feels this way, but asks if she doesn't feel lonely when he goes out, or if she doesn't want to go out and buy things she wants. Sakura says she doesn't really want to buy anything special. As a house, she just wants to stay close to her owner. Everything Daichi needs can be found around the house, and if he needs something, the human servants will bring it to him. The most important thing is that he can be at home. Sakura emotionally says the best thing is to be able to take care of her master, when Daichi can relax at home, cook and do the laundry, then prepare the bath and welcome a new day. She feels very happy with moments like that. Entrusting all these tasks to Sakura makes Daichi feel that life is wonderful. He is very grateful. But sometimes he feels Sakura should move around more often. She firmly refused because she wanted her master to be as comfortable as possible, and just lying there made Sakura truly happy. Sakura asked Daichi if he wanted a pillow, and upon his agreement, she gently placed his head on her thighs. After touching Sakura's body, Daichi was automatically synchronized, and he commanded the golems to repel the stone people in favor of the smaller figurines. Lying under the gentle sunlight with his head on a warm thigh pillow, the sun was pleasantly warm, allowing him to feel Sakura's body temperature. Today was the best day, and his house was the best. Daichi held his staff and chanted a spell. Then 100 golems immediately appeared, a surprisingly large number. He excitedly praised the staff for being incredible. noting it wasn't even cracked. Hesty, rubbing her eyes and smiling, had put all her effort into making it without any rest. Suddenly, her stomach growled, indicating she was hungry. Dachi picked an apple and offered it to Hesty. She eagerly bit into the apple, crunching even the seeds, clearly very hungry. But the apple was so rich in magic that just one was enough to restore her magic. Dachi said they could wait for her to rest before continuing, but Hesty firmly disagreed because the amount of magic he was using with the spell was increasing. So if they didn't hurry, she wouldn't finish in time. Lately, the golems had become more detailed, stronger, bigger, and more powerful. They were indeed becoming more dominant. Hesty just needed to remember that the more detailed they were, the more magic they consumed. Anyway, Dachi wanted to thank Hesty for everything, from gathering materials to creating the staff. Hesty humbly denied it was all due to her interest, and he was the one who had paid. Dachi was concerned because the materials included Hesty's bones, but he was mistaken as what she referred to earlier were actually claws and scales, so she could have them when shedding. And even if they ran out, they could be replaced, as many Dragon Kings have similar bones. There might be some differences in magic power or hardness, but the materials themselves do not vary. Thus, they could be substituted, for example with Anne. Before she could finish speaking, Anne appeared suddenly at an incredible speed, thinking Hesty was calling her. She moved so fast that it took Hesty by surprise, unable to react in time. Anne bowed to Dachi while accidentally pressing her chest into Hesty's face, nearly suffocating the latter. Hesty pushed her away, stating that no one had called her, and then quickly ran towards Dachi. Anne was surprised that this time, Hesty managed to get away so quickly and looked up to see the 100 giant golems that had been created, sensing a dense amount of magical power. Hesty proudly said that they were made from the apple tree, and with a spell, quite surprised that Anne could detect this. Anne, both surprised and intrigued, said it was the first time she had seen someone with such accuracy, and it was completely different from when Dachi used the spell. Anne greatly admired him because she also made golems, and she was really surprised and impressed. Hesty hid behind Dachi, not daring to show her face. Dachi asked Anne why she had come today. Anne replied that she wanted to apologize for the mess the previous day, wondering if Dachi had heard that the mud puppet was her doing. After hearing that he knew, Anne sincerely bowed her head in apology. Dachi laughed and said he didn't appreciate her messing up his garden, but since she had apologized, he would let it go. Anne loudly declared that beside an apology, there should be a punishment. Right? She anticipated what punishment he would give her, wondering if Dachi would spank her with a magical whip. Dachi was speechless at her strange behavior, saying he had forgiven her, so there would be no punishment, and besides, Anne said sorry. But why was she here? That reminded her, Anne brought Dachi several of her magical items, which were recovery potions extracted from Dragon King blood, which could be sold at a reasonable price, and could heal almost anything, from cuts to broken bones. They work immediately upon use, seeming like an all-powerful remedy. Hesty mentioned that magical items are objects containing a significant amount of magical effect, having many uses in both everyday life and in warfare. Just as Dachi expected, Hesty proudly said that if there was anything he didn't understand, she would explain everything to him. Anne has a hobby of making them, and she is good at it. Being the newest Dragon King, she enjoys creating items after infusing them with her magic. Although initially she was just imitating her sister, Hesty explained that she only makes staffs, but Anne creates all sorts, from potions to support items. Anne refuted, contrary to what Hesty said, she can't make staffs. When it comes to making refined weapons, Hesty always excels. It turns out they make different items, but nonetheless, the most outstanding is the one who made these golems with absolute precision, Dachi. Anne happily said that since Dachi creates wooden golems and works outdoors, this recovery potion is even more suitable for him. Whether Dachi cuts his hand or trips over a root and breaks his leg, this potion can heal everything. Initially, he let the golems take care of the trees, but this potion will be very useful if he ever gets injured. Dachi happily accepted it and thanked Anne, who mentioned it was just a token of apology that she owed him anyway. Anne also had something to report to them. It seems there will now be monster waves in the magical forest. Dachi worriedly asked if something was happening there. Anne replied that there were some issues under the forest, but was only temporary, so Dachi shouldn't worry about it. He resolved to keep a vigilant watch. After that, she bid farewell to them. Dachi mentioned if they run out of the potion, to just let him know, and he would bring more. She was cheerful and did not forget to hug Hesty goodbye. Because Hesty had stayed up all night making the staff, she would now go to rest, and Daichi cheerfully saw her off. Daichi sighed, thinking that Anne becoming a noisy doorstep pharmacist might make his house more lively. Inside the Prussian castle, the witch reported to Princess Dionea that the preparations for the magic shield were complete. Dionea responded to start the trial. She would leave the observation to the chief knight. The chief knight obeyed the princess's command and shouted to begin. The witches lined up and chanted a spell to summon the waters. Immediately, a large body of water appeared and moved toward the princess. Dionea tried to recall the feeling in the forest when Daichi had boosted her strength. She chanted a spell that incinerated everything, creating a massive explosion. The chief knight praised her, noting her ability to deflect a water projectile with the strength of 10 wizards, and the speed of her chanting, setting a new record. The princess thought it was only slightly stronger than the original magic, and still had areas that needed improvement. This wasn't enough to even scratch a dragon. The magic she used then, with Daichi's magic, was much stronger. It should have been hotter and more penetrative. She reminded herself that if she didn't improve, she couldn't keep up with him. If Dionea remembered correctly, she would have to do paperwork then visit Daichi after this event, right? The chief knight nodded, confirming her plans. Dionea resolved to rely on the head knight and the wizard's council in the coming time. At Hesty's residence, she and Daichi were chatting. Hesty mentioned that it seemed Daichi hadn't yet damaged the spare staff, to which he agreed, noting it was very easy to use even after many times. Hesty proudly stated that it was because she had spent the entire night making it, but there were already many small cracks on the staff. Daichi couldn't see them with the naked eye, but she could see magical energy leaking from it. That's why she planned to improve it. As they were talking animatedly, Princess Dionea visited, carrying something on her back and in a very good mood. Although a bit strenuous, she had had a great training session and felt very relaxed. Dionea then dropped the bag down and asked Daichi to take it, explaining that it contained money from his last visit to the town, where the herbal farms had absorbed his magic, resulting in an exceptionally good harvest. Daichi, somewhat stunned, accepted it and thought it seemed he would have some money stuck at home. But perhaps Hesty could use it for materials for the recent staffs. Hesty, exhausted, nodded off and fell asleep on Daichi's shoulder. Having used magic from the moment she woke up, he carried her into the cabin, unbothered, and the little girl couldn't resist sleep. Seeing this, Dionea remarked, "That's really nice." Blushing deeply, the princess excused herself from Daichi, embarrassed by her open display of jealousy. Her eyes burning, she decided to walk home to calm down. At Daichi's house, Anne arrived again, bringing a gift, a portable potion flask. It was a container designed to keep potions safe and was very practical as it could be used immediately if Daichi got injured while gardening. Hesty asked Anne if she had used Dragon King skin to make it, specifically from under the wings. Hesty could tell just by looking. Anne, excited, praised Hesty for accurately identifying the material with just a glance. But as a Dragon King, it meant Anne had used her own skin, making the flask indestructible, even by Daichi's magic. Daichi was concerned that Hesty had done the same, wondering why they both frequently used their bodies as materials. Anne replied that it was just a small piece of skin, so it was fine, and it would heal in just a few seconds anyway. Daichi brightly said he would happily accept it, feeling a bit embarrassed since he seemed to keep receiving gifts from her. Anne cheerfully told him not to worry about it, because just sharing the air with Hesty was payment enough. Besides Hesty, Anne also received a lot from Daichi, like the chance to observe the golems, which she considered a top-tier magical tool, and she could use them as models for her own creations. By the way, Daichi asked Anne if she also made golems, to which she responded that she did, but the quality of hers was nothing compared to his. Once compared, Daichi would understand, she said, then clasped her hands and chanted an invocation, and a clump of black mud fell from her hands, forming a small figurine. Daichi smiled, realizing this was Anne's ability. Hesty mentioned that Anne was the Iron Dragon King, which is why there was both mud and metal in it, forming a foundation for success in magical tool creation as a new Dragon King. This was Anne's golem. Although it would take time to perfect, and wasn't as durable, it was strong enough to fight off monsters. Hesty approached and patted the golem, praising Anne for improving, noting that the magical power she infused into it was increasing. Anne, thrilled by the compliment, rushed over and hugged Hesty tightly in gratitude. Daichi asked Anne if it would be okay for him to make a golem like that, as the mud Anne had produced last time was still there. Anne responded that theoretically, it was possible since the materials were still there. But the process would be completely different from the wooden golems, so it might be challenging. Daichi still wanted to try. He summoned a mud golem, and then from nowhere, a mass of writhing black mud appeared, 10 times larger than the one Anne had created. Anne was stunned, not understanding how he could do it. Daichi commanded the mud golem to punch a large rock in front of it, which it obliterated with its force. Anne was in disbelief, seeing that it was more powerful than her own creation. Even the best golem masters would cry if Daichi said that was a slow reaction. It was just because the quality of Daichi's wooden golems was exceptionally high, and indeed, his golems could execute commands easily. Daichi mentioned that besides that, he thought he could create something other than golems from this mud, and asked Anne if he could have that mud. Anne, with a bright smile, responded, "Of course." On the border between Prussia and the Enchanted Forest, Princess Danaea was diligently practicing her fire sword over and over again. After a while, she decided to stop and told the chief knight that he had been a great help, but wondered if his team would be okay in his absence. The chief knight replied that he had already given orders, so there would be no problems, and leaving the princess alone here was more dangerous. After all, the dungeon was active today, so they had to be very cautious. Danaea agreed, noting that although the monster tide hadn't arrived yet, they were only hunting normal monsters at the moment. According to Anne, the monster tide was supposed to arrive in 2 or 3 days, but now it had been over 3 days. They were late, but this delay gave them more time to prepare. Fortunate to have many influential people in the capital. The adventurers, the Shining Head, had completed 90% of their tasks from the central city. Fortunately, they were on a mission in the capital, and the chief knight was very grateful for their help in defending the city. However, the monsters around here are quite strong, and an ordinary adventurer would struggle facing 2 at a time. The princess replied with a grimace that a single fanger could easily kill a person, and in the Enchanted Forest, one could be swallowed by a giant slime if distracted. There are also many creatures that are difficult to deal with if they do not work together. And now that the creatures in the dungeon have started to move together, it's no longer a joking matter. It would be better if Prussia had enough time to reinforce their defenses. The chief knight said he had invited other adventurers, but the kingdom also needed a lot of resources, and issues were compounding, with the kingdom not having enough supplies to create barriers to make the city impregnable. Danaea resolved that no matter what, they cannot afford delays, and instructed to switch to another objective. The princess said she would go ask the werewolf about the situation inside the forest and delegated the inspection of the defenses to the knight. She then immediately teleported to the wolf clan leader. Upon arrival, the wolf leader politely greeted her, with his sister by his side. Danaea apologized for her late arrival. He said she was only a few minutes late and knew she was busy hunting monsters on the plains, which greatly helped them. As expected from the wolves, he was aware of it even though it had only been a few minutes. After all, gathering information and transporting goods are the strengths of the wolves. The wolf leader said he had prepared a corner in the square, where he would give Danaea the report. On their way there, she saw some children around and happily noted that everything was becoming quite developed. Although she had been here many times, it was becoming more lively and peaceful. The wolf leader looked up proudly and said that in a few decades, this place would be perfect. Thanks to Daichi, many transactions could be carried out, and also thanks to that the infrastructure was increasingly enhanced. Even the gratitude of the entire pack was not enough to repay him. At a rough-hewed table and chairs, the wolf leader confirmed that the monsters had begun to become more active. Their numbers had not changed much, but their range had expanded, so the likelihood of encounters was high. It wasn't just the influence from the dungeon. The number of Earth-type monsters appearing was unusually high, like worms emerging from the ground. Normally, these would not appear around here, or perhaps they had been underground and unseen until now. The presence of Daichi had also somewhat altered the local ecosystem, and the types and numbers of monsters they had encountered so far included names of some species they hadn't seen in several months living in this area. The two continued to sit, discussing the monsters and expressing gratitude for Daichi's contributions. After a while, Danaea bid farewell to the wolf siblings and headed towards Daichi's house, her face bright with anticipation.